This is tape recording of a presentation on John Muir and Friends, the Wisconsin Influence, held at Montello City Hall in Montello, Wisconsin, on Sunday, May 28, 1989. Presentation and speakers was organized by George Bresnick and Erik Brynildson. The slate of presenters includes the following. After an introduction, we have George Bresnick speaking on Ralph Waldo Emerson and Jeanne Carr, the Madison Connection. Following that, Bruce Allison will talk about the Muir Locust, the tree that we just saw on the Madison campus. Following that, Ed Schofield will talk about the connections, John Muir's Yankee friends and mentors. Following that, R.S. Chapin will read some poems called Wisconsin's History Lesson, John Muir on a Hill in Marquette County. With that, there was a short break, followed by a presentation by Grace Larson, Jeanne Carr, The Miracle of Pasadena. Following that, Frank Buskey will speak about John Muir River. Following that, Curt Meine will speak about the Wisconsin Wilderness Connection, Leopold and John Muir. Next, Randall will read some poems from Big Maple Springs, and the final presentation by Erik Brynildson dealing with Fountain Lake Farm, a pioneer homestead. With that, we will begin our presentation.
At the outset, I really want to thank Bill Edwards, who was standing in the back of the room, who used to be standing in the back of the room, who made this place possible for us and made all the arrangements for us to be here this afternoon in the City Hall. The title that we've chosen is John Muir and Friends, the Wisconsin Influence. And I think that there is a double meaning perhaps to John Muir and Friends, one being that a number of the people that we will talk about this afternoon were in fact friends of John Muir, mentors of John Muir, and inspired by John Muir. And I think also Friends describes the group of people who are here today who really as a focal point have this rather remarkable individual, even 150 years after his birth, still excited and enthused and feeling a sense of camaraderie about his ideas and the work that he did. I've chosen to start off and done it mostly, I guess, to break the ice and also to get a little bit of an introductory remark.
Frank has asked that his presentation not be taped. I will be taping unless you ask me not to. Is there anyone else in the audience that does not want to be taped? Okay, thank you.
I think we will have to, in order to see the slides, dim the lights enough, so as long as we can do it without everybody being in the dark. The back. I think if we leave the back one on, Bill, that might work. Let's see how it'll work once we get started. So I hope that this will serve, first of all, as a sample of how I got interested in this whole area, and also as an introduction to some of the other talks that will be following mine. John Muir lived in Madison from 1861 to 1863 while attending the University of Wisconsin. His friendship with Jeanne Carr began during these years and led through her to associations with a number of America's greatest literary and scientific figures. During the program today, we will hear more of John Muir's relationships with Jeanne Carr and with the others of her circle. In my presentation, I would like to describe some episodes that occurred in Madison during and a few years immediately after John Muir's university years that illustrate the environment in which his formal education took place. On January 26, 1867, the transplanted New Englanders eagerly awaited the arrival in Madison of their intellectual progenitor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Concord sage who had placed American intellectual endeavors on a firm native footing. Emerson was on one of his periodic lecture tours throughout the Midwest. These trips were a mixed blessing for him that took him away from his family, but allowed him to renew acquaintances among the pioneers of frontier America. And this actually is how I got started in this whole area. When I heard that Emerson had come to Madison, I wanted to figure out who did he know, who did he contact, why did he come here. Emerson must have appealed to these hardy individualists with his Yankee demeanor and stalwart philosophy, exemplified in his essay Self-Reliance. Many of them had given up the security of New England hamlets for the hardships and uncertainties of the West. Nostalgic reminders of the New England roots were in evidence in Madison, however. Familiar foods were available at the New England Bakery on Main Street, where cakes, brown bread, and Boston crackers were advertised. And the New England boarding house on Webster Street provided lodgings. The extent to which the Madisonians identified with New England can be gleaned from a note in the Wisconsin State Journal, published in Madison on December 23, 1866, 2 weeks before Emerson's visit. The subheading announced the anniversary supper of the New England Society in Madison, celebrating Forefathers' Day, the commemoration of the landing of the Pilgrims in Plymouth on December 21, 1620. Held at the Vilas House at the corner of Main and Wisconsin Avenue, it was a festive, well-attended event. The chairman of the celebrations committee read excerpts from letters received from prominent New England figures. And if we could, actually we have to turn on the first one. Should go smoothly from there. And here is one of the prominent New England figures who wrote. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote from Massachusetts, saying, hoping that the transplanted institutions of New England may thrive as vigorously in Madison as on their native rock. Holmes, by the way, was one of the founding members of the Saturday Club, a select Boston literary club begun in 1857, including Emerson and Louis Agassiz. The latter, Agassiz, as we shall see, was the likely link between Emerson and Jeanne Carr, and ultimately on to John Muir. Another letter received by the Celebrations Committee came from the governor of Connecticut, who in a proselytizing message stated, the influence exerted upon the West by New England men and ideas, great as it is acknowledged to be, is not likely to be overestimated, and it is exceedingly pleasant for us who stay at the old homestead to see that it is not forgotten by our absent friends. It is in this context, reminiscent of the Hellenizing zeal of ancient Greeks in Asia Minor, that we should view the appearance of Emerson on Wisconsin soil. A little bit of hyperbole, but close to the mark, I think. The next slide shows City Hall. Emerson, when he arrived by train, rode in a sleigh because it was had been such a stormy day the day before, rode in a sleigh from the train station to the Madison City Hall on Wisconsin Avenue, where a large audience waited to listen to Emerson's lecture to the Madison Institute. The lecture, entitled Society, was well received by an enthusiastic crowd. The subject matter was manners, dress, hospitality, social intercourse, and the proper conduct of life. He had more than 15 minutes to present it. It was, however, his personal presence and bearing that probably most captivated his audience. And this is a quote from the Wisconsin State Journal. He bears his age, 63, well. His brown hair is scarcely touched with gray, and his slight stoop is rather that of the student than of the old man. In his general physical configuration, he's a genuine Yankee, tall, lean, and angular. His face is thin and his features marked and prominent. The nose, in particular, is conspicuous, a prodigious promontory of the Roman type with ample nostrils. His head looks small, but with a good development of the portion which phrenologists assign to the perceptive and reflective faculties. He has a peculiarly pleasant smile and a fine, sonorous, flexible, sympathetic voice. Although we have no direct evidence that Jeanne Carr attended the lecture, it's almost certain that she would have. And as we shall see later, Emerson visited her at the University of Wisconsin on the following Monday morning, the lecture taking place on a Saturday. In fact, Jeanne Carr's son, Al Carr, recalled many years later in his unpublished memoirs entitled The Trail of Yesterday, that Emerson was among the many visiting luminaries who stopped at their home on West Gilman Street in Madison. Al Carr, referring to Emerson, stated, his philosophy was beyond my youthful grasp, and I never got used to his high, old-fashioned collar and enormous black stock worn with it, though it certainly was the granddaddy of all neckties. And he goes on to say, but Oliver Wendell Holmes' visit following Emerson's was enjoyed, for he spoke a language that a boy could understand. There are no notations for Jeanne Carr in Emerson's notebooks before January of 1867. How he knew her is conjectural. Jeanne Carolyn Smith Carr, whoops, wrong one, that's okay, was born in Castleton, Vermont in 1825. She attended the Castleton Seminary for Girls, where early interest in botany was fostered by the school principal, an inspiring teacher who taught her techniques of botanical specimen collection and identification, a role that she was to play in the education of John Muir. The link between Jeanne Carr and Emerson may have been her husband Ezra Slocum Carr. Ezra Carr in 1842 was appointed to the faculty of the Castleton Medical College, a prominent homeopathic medical institution of the time. Between 1846 and 1850, he lectured alternatively at Castleton and at the Philadelphia Medical College. While in Philadelphia, the Carrs made the acquaintance of America's foremost acting family, a friendship that would later lead to a fascinating episode in the history of Madison to be related further on in the presentation. The family was none other than the Booths, and it was the father, Junius Brutus Booth, who became very interested in Philadelphia in Dr. Carr's research work, and when not engaged in the theater, was usually found in the laboratory engrossed in the experiments. In 1856, the Carrs moved to Madison, where Ezra was appointed professor of chemistry and later of natural history at the six-year-old university. And at that time, he was one of only 5 professors at the university. He was also a friend of Louis Agassiz, the Swiss-born Harvard professor of geology. Agassiz, as mentioned before, was a member of Ralph Waldo Emerson's inner circle of literary and scientific friends, and it may well have been through Agassiz that the Carrs became personally acquainted with Emerson in New England. Jeanne Carr pursued her botanical interest in Wisconsin, and as an agent for the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society, in September of 1860, went to the State Agricultural Fair to view the incredible handmade wooden inventions of John Muir, a young man who came from the farmlands outside of Montello in Marquette County. When John Muir entered the university in 1861, he studied chemistry and geology with Ezra Carr and classics with one of the university's favorite professors, James Davy Butler, himself a Vermont native. Muir also spent memorable hours in the Carrs' sandstone house at 114 West Gilman Street, a house which still stands at its original location. The Carr home provided Muir a different environment from the strict, austere atmosphere in the Marquette County farmhouse, ruled over by his dour and at times seemingly cruel Scots father. John Muir, in a letter to Jeanne Carr in September of 1865, recalled that delightful kernel of your house, your library, with its portraits of scientific men upon its walls, and such bountiful store of their sheaves into the blossoms and verdure of your little kingdom of plants, luxuriant and happy as if opening their leaves under the open sky of the most flower-loving zone of the world. Somebody recently reading that said to me, well, I guess I understand what purple prose is all about. Al Carr recalled in his memoirs that, quote, up to the time of our departure from Madison, Muir was practically a member of the family, sharing my quarters. He was a shy, retiring young man with still a slight burr of his native Scotland upon his tongue. We know, of course, that John Muir lived in North Hall, where many of us spent about an hour this morning, but he spent a considerable amount of time in the Carr household, according to Al Carr. In June of 1863, Muir left the University of Wisconsin, and in March of 64 left the state for, quote, botanizing and for work in Canada, partly as a result of his distaste for the horrors and brutality of the Civil War that were evident to him on a daily basis in the military barracks, the Army hospital, and in the Confederate prison at Camp Randall. Jeanne Carr was predictably very active in Madison and during the war, and she was active in relief work for the troops during the Civil War. She was president of the Ladies Union League, an organization that provided bandages and other medical supplies to wounded and ill soldiers in the battle areas. In 1863, she was one of the main organizers of something called the Northwestern Sanitary Fair, held in the fall of that year in Chicago as a major fundraising event for soldiers' relief. It was her idea to create an exhibition hall at the fair, over which she presided, and called the exhibition hall the Curiosity Shop. It was in this shop that personal items donated by famous Americans, along with Civil War relics, were displayed and sold. In a letter to Ralph Waldo Emerson in September of 1863, Jeanne Carr enclosed a circular for the Great Northwestern Fair and requested him to send as a donation an autograph, photograph, and copy of some of his works. The catalog for the fair, published afterwards, does not indicate that Emerson actually sent anything, perhaps because the letter was written only 1 month before the fair started. Nonetheless, the Curiosity Shop was a great attraction and financial success. Jeanne Carr and her associates managed to obtain for sale from Professor Louis Agassiz a large collection of his works and some very fine signed geological charts. From Professor Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, several sets of poems with autographs attached. And coup from Abraham Lincoln, his personal original draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, written and corrected in his own hand and purchased by the Honorable T.B. Bryan for a sum of $3,000. A fascinating incident that relates the Carrs and Madison to the events surrounding the Civil War harkens back to the Booth family in Philadelphia. On the heels of Lee's surrender to General Grant at Appomattox in April of 1865, the actor John Wilkes Booth, as we all know, shot Abraham Lincoln and fled from Ford's Theater as he regaled the fallen chief with the cry, Sic Semper Tyrannis. In the wake of this shocking event, public suspicions of a larger conspiracy in the death of Lincoln ran high. In fact, not only the other members of the Booth family, his brother Brutus Booth Jr., and the most famous of the acting family, Edwin Booth, but many others of the acting profession at large were kept under close surveillance, if not placed under outright arrest. In actuality, the other Booths were not only shocked by their brother's deed, but deeply ashamed. And Edwin Booth canceled his acting engagements for about a year, despondent as to whether he would ever be able to return to the stage. It was at this time of self-doubt and humiliation that Edwin Booth, in the company of his friend and fellow actor James Murdoch, sought the help and comfort of his old friends, Jeanne and Ezra Carr, and spent the winter of 1865 in their home in Madison, Wisconsin. Returning to Emerson's 1867 visit with Jeanne Carr, we can surmise from a letter that Emerson sent to Benjamin Wiley, a Chicago banker and great admirer of Thoreau, on February 6, 1867, that Thoreau was a topic of discussion between them. Thoreau had died in Concord on May 6, 1862, before many of his personal writings could be developed into publishable form. The publication of the journals had become a major preoccupation for Emerson, who felt a profound personal commitment to the task. In his letter to Wiley, Emerson states, "Perhaps only Reverend Mr. Brooks of Hamilton College in Madison, New York, is, I learned from Mrs. Carr at Wisconsin University, the second Thoreau, who she thinks is fit to edit the field notes of the first. Him I have not yet seen." Emerson was somewhat confused in his recollections. The Reverend Mr. Brooks mentioned by Jeanne Carr was almost certainly Walter R. Brooks, a Baptist pastor connected with Madison University, now Colgate, in Hamilton, New York, and later a lecturer in natural history at that institution. The Carrs knew Brooks from the years 1856 to 1858, when he was the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Madison. It would appear that Jeanne Carr's advocacy of Brooks as a potential literary editor for Thoreau goes back further to the time of Thoreau's death in 1862. In the only known direct letter from Emerson to Jeanne Carr, dated May 12, 1865, he writes to her in Madison from Concord, "Dear Madam, I am grieved to see before me at this moment the date of your letter and compare it with mine. I carried it at once to Miss Sophia Thoreau, the only sister of my friend, and she was interested and gratified as I was. She kept the letter, and with some vague feeling that it rather implied a duty and possible or probable discovery of guidance in months to come, still postponed the immediate duty of thanking you heartily for the comfort and hope your own letter imparted. Mr. Thoreau has left, I think, 22 manuscript volumes of field notes, as he called them, running over the last 10 years of his life. I shall use my opportunities to know Mr. Brooks, by letter or by conversation." One can surmise from the tenor and content of the letter that Jeanne Carr's original letter to Emerson was probably sent as a note of solace and encouragement shortly after Thoreau's death in 1862. This has some implications for Muir scholars, since there is some controversy as to when Muir first read Thoreau and to what extent Thoreau influenced John Muir's early writings and ideas. Linnie Marsh Wolfe, in her classic biography of John Muir, suggests that it was in the Carr house in Madison, amidst the tall bookshelves, that Muir first came under the influence of Agassiz, Wordsworth, Thoreau, and Emerson. On the other hand, Stephen Fox, in the American Conservation Movement, claims that Muir first read Thoreau apparently at the behest of Jeanne Carr during his Yosemite years, which would have been late 1860s and 70s and beyond. A perusal of the Madison newspapers from May of 1862 reveals two notices of Thoreau's death in the Wisconsin State Journal. On May 14th, on the front page, a brief article announces, quote, "The death of Henry D. Thoreau. This quiet thinker and scholar, one of the most original of American writers, died of consumption at Concord, Mass. On Wednesday of last week." On May 17th, an announcement of the funeral of Henry Thoreau was given and excerpts of Emerson's eulogy was quoted in the article. Thus, although we cannot be certain exactly when John Muir first read Thoreau, we can at least say that Thoreau's name was enough of a household word in Madison in 1862 to be prominently displayed in the local newspapers at his death. And Jeanne Carr was writing to Emerson and to Thoreau's sister, recommending an editor for Thoreau's works probably also as early as 1862. It's therefore difficult not to conclude that John Muir, her prized protege, was familiar with Thoreau's ideas, if not his very language. When in 1871 Emerson planned a trip to the West, he included Jeanne Carr in his list of old friends to visit. The Carrs at this time had moved to California. She wrote to John Muir at Yosemite in rhapsodic terms. The old singer would soon be in the places where we have sung his song. Emerson arrived at the Carrs' house in May of 1871, and Jeanne handed him a letter of introduction to John Muir and encouraged Emerson to visit this, quote, remarkable young man. Emerson arrived at Yosemite on May 5th, and the meeting between the two men is well documented in Muir's writings. So impressed was Emerson with Muir, and the next slide, oh, sorry, that was, see, we get them mixed up, Thoreau and Muir sometimes. The next one shows John Muir. So impressed was Emerson with Muir that only 1 month after their initial meeting, he included Muir's name on a list entitled My Men, that included such outstanding figures as Thomas Carlyle, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Henry David Thoreau. Jeanne Carr acknowledged to Muir that Emerson was their inspirational muse. In a lively exchange of letters, Emerson encouraged Muir to come east and join the faculty of a leading Eastern university. Muir opted to stay in what he termed the University of the Wilderness. The person responsible for bringing these two kindred spirits together was Jean Smith Carr. The seed for this union was planted in Madison, Wisconsin, on a blustery day in January in 1867. That gives us some of the background of John Muir, his friends, and connections with Jeanne Carr. And the next talk is entitled The Muir Locust by Bruce Allison. And if I can get my notes straight, I know that Bruce is an arborist because my trees are healthy, smiling, as a result of the tender, loving care he gives them. He did his undergraduate degree at Brown University, where he studied English. He has a master's in urban forestry from the University of Wisconsin, and he is a PhD dissertator in the land resources program.
To be here, boy, this is fantastic. As George pointed out, I'm an arborist. I make my living caring for trees. I'm also a writer. I spend a large part of my time writing or teaching writing, a lot of reading, which is the source of being a good writer, I think, is doing a lot of reading. George, can go to the next slide? I'll just sort of raise my hand. And one of my favorite topics, obviously, aside from the professional interest, are trees. Trees are incredibly beautiful. The oldest living species, most massive of all trees, the Sequoia sempervirens out of California, of course, inspired John Muir, but they inspire everybody year after year. In backwards, but I combined my interest in trees with a couple books about trees. When I came to Wisconsin, I introduced to a man by the name of Walter Scott, who was one of those people that carried me along. I said, gee, Walter, I know you've got this American Forestry Association collection of big trees in the state. Has anyone ever put that together into a popular book? And he said, well, no, but such a big task. Well, I'd like to try something like that. So I ended up producing this particular book, which was called Wisconsin's Champion Trees. Walter Scott, phenomenal man. I remember sitting in his front lawn in Madison in a house that was on the National Historic House list, which he called Hickory Hill House. Yes, he was a man who loved John Muir also. He had, when I asked for help on putting together my book about trees, brought out 3 or 4 cardboard boxes of notes that he had gathered over his 25, 30-year career with what was then the Department of Natural Resources, which was then the Department of Conservation, which is now the Department of Natural Resources. He said, Bruce, I'll help you along. Here's all I have put together. At this time, he unfortunately already had cancer, knew that his days were numbered. Well, it's a great, easy task, and of course I got involved in all of this writing and research and realized, boy, I understand why Walter waited 25 years of gathering notes. Next slide. He every day would step outside of his house called Hickory Hill House and measure this tree, which was does anyone know that species? It's a box elder, of all trees, a box elder, which Emerson once said that a weed is merely a plant whose purpose has yet to be found. And Walter found a purpose for this tree. Every spring, he would get out there and measure that tree. That was the first tree to enter the book, Wisconsin's Champion Trees, and is the most recorded of all box elders, I'm sure, in the United States, if not the world. Next. I'd like to always say this is the largest tree in the state of Wisconsin, but it's not. That's not in Oaxaca, Mexico. Here is the largest tree in the state of Wisconsin, a remarkable tree. And in the process of doing this book, I realized, my God, trees have a phenomenal relationship to people. People love trees. I'm not sure that I can quantify this or even explain it in words, but there's a special relationship between people and trees. Also in backwards, I don't do most of my books backwards, but Walter's incredible notes, of course, led me to my next book, Wisconsin's Famous and Historic Trees, a book that was one that I think Walter always wanted to write himself, but unfortunately the old man with the scythe caught up with him, and he just didn't have the time to do it. So I think he was delighted to have me come along, and once he tested me with this first book, he felt comfortable that perhaps I could do his bidding on the next book. And Walter then set another 10 or 20 cardboard boxes in front of me as I began to do research on that. Well, within the research of this, and let's go to the next one, comes to the heart of my talk today, and that's the John Muir Locust, perhaps the most important historical tree in the state of Wisconsin, perceived for many years by people from California and elsewhere where John Muir's name was more well established. And researchers from the University of California would come all the time. The first thing they would do when they spent some time in the library is say, now I want to see this locust that John Muir talked about in his book. And in his book, The Story of My Boyhood and Youth, many of you have heard this passage, and those of you who were on the North Hall area and campus with us earlier, we've already read this, but let me reread it. John Muir, age 19, 1863, a student on campus, stepped outside of North Hall, and there was another student of his by the name of Griswold who wanted to introduce him to the science of botany. John Muir at that point was primarily in engineering. I received my first lesson in botany from a student by the name of Griswold, who is now county judge of the county of Waukesha, Wisconsin. In the university, he was often laughed at on account of his anxiety to instruct others, and is frequently saying with a fine emphasis, imparting instruction is my greatest enjoyment. One memorable day in June, when I was standing on the stone steps of the North Dormitory, Mr. Griswold joined me and at once began to teach. He reached up, plucked a flower from an overreaching branch of a locust tree, and handed it to me, saying, Muir, do you know what family this tree belongs to? No, I said, I don't know anything about botany. Well, no matter, he said. What is it like? That's right. He said, it's like a pea flower, he replied. That's right, you're right, Griswold said. It belongs to the pea family. But, Muir said, how can that be when the pea is a weak, clinging, straggly herb, and the locust is a big, thorny, hardwood tree? Griswold then opened up this wonderful world taxonomy to John Muir, that interconnectedness of all the botanical world, the thing that connects that herbaceous plant, the pea flower, and the pea plant to a large woody plant, the locust tree. And here we have a sample of that when we were on the site. The original John Muir locust is not there, but we found some others. Here's what a Robinia pseudoacacia, the black locust plant, looks like. And oddly enough, the French were some of the first people to bring this. If you've ever gone to France, you can see that on their estates they have this tree lining many of their boulevards. They love the beautiful, fragrant flower that occurs in the spring. One of the first and most beautiful flowers. And I'll just pass that around for those people who haven't had a chance to eat it. What happened to the John Muir Locust? A tree that I think should still have been here as a monument to this great man, John Muir. In 1963, a decision was made to cut this tree down. The decision was made that somehow this was unsafe, was going to harm students who might pass beneath it, and consequently, it was cut down. If we go to the next slide. A sad moment, I think, because in 1963, I don't think Muir had the name that he does now. I think that decision had to be made in 1983. It would have been a different thing. More effort would have been made to preserve this particular tree. However, E.B. Fred, who was president of the university at that time, was indeed a lover of the history of the campus, especially the landscape history. And he asked Professor Walter Rowlands, a professor who also has an avocation, woodworking, to take pieces of that tree and carve it into mementos, which E.B. Fred then would mail out to those people who he knew had a love and affection for John Muir. Walter Scott had some photographs from the Capital Times and the State Journal which showed some of that story, that unfolding debate and drama between cut the tree down and save the tree. But that's all I really had in terms of data on this. I thought for sure there'd be more information preserved about this, and yet nothing was available. I went to the State Historical Society, which is a great repository of information. I couldn't find anything of any help there. I couldn't even find photographs of this tree. These are all photographs that were discovered after I first learned of the event. Walter Scott could be of no help there. Well, I first went to the Photo Media Lab. I thought, well, surely somebody would have realized the importance of this tree, taking photographs at the time. And I went there, and if anyone's ever been to the Photo Media Lab knows it's a very innocuous-looking 60s kind of building. And an old gentleman who I discovered later was about 2 months from retirement came up to the counter and he said, well, what do you want? I said, well, I want to find some pictures of the John Muir Locust. He said, I remember that. No, there's no photographs of that. I said, well, are you sure? Can we look, maybe cross-reference it, come up with something? And nothing could be found. Well, I went away a little unhappy about that. But then I went to the Archives Memorial Union, and I said, well, surely E.B. Fred would have preserved perhaps his letters that he sent out to all of these people to whom he sent mementos. Surely I can find something in there, maybe even a reference to a photograph somewhere. So I went down to the deep, deep basement of Memorial Union, which anyone who's ever gone down there knows it's a bit of a bomb shelter. They took out these cardboard boxes from the period in which this was happening. And E.B. Fred was a great chronicler of his own life and events. Every letter that he ever wrote was recorded there. So it took me hours and hours and hours. I had to blow the dust off the top, but I finally found that file in which he had kept not only his letter going out to all the recipients of this memento, but also all the letters that came back in return, and that was the most powerful discovery I've ever come across. Plus, I also discovered in those particular files a reference to the Photo Media Lab picture, the recording of that event, taking this tree down. With that number in hand, I went back to the Photo Media Lab and spoke to that same gentleman. He says, oh yeah, well, I think these are probably thrown away some time ago. Let's see if we have them. And he went back after looking probably for 2 or 3 hours. I came back after his lunchtime, and he brought out an envelope about this size and said, well, let's open this up. Obviously, it hadn't been opened up in many years. Opened it up, looked inside, and there he literally shook out the dust from these emulsified photographs. However, of the several that were in there, there were 2 or 3 that he pulled out. They were very fragile, falling apart as he did it. And he said, well, we can't do anything with these. These are just negatives. It's too late. They're gone. We'll probably just have to throw them away. I said, please. I explained the importance of the John Muir Locust. I read him this passage from my boyhood interview, and I said, please make every effort you can to see if you can't just restore these photographs in some form or fashion. And this is the result. I think it is a beautiful job. Photographs that were probably only 3 or 4 years from having been totally lost and destroyed, but brought back up photographs of a tree that to John Muir and to many others is a remarkable tree. In those return letters, I found one that is particularly moving that I think sums up in words far better than mine the impact that the removal of this tree had on some people. And this is by Wakeland McNeil. Those in Wisconsin know Wakeland McNeil as Ranger Mac. He had a show on WHA radio where he spoke about environmental education, environmental issues, especially to children. And in his letter, he said to E.B. Fred, "I do not know what we are going to do now that the tree is gone. It stood there as a tangible, effective, though silent spokesman of a turning point in a man's life, of a time of decision that made the outdoors his university and gave the world John Muir. A gavel shouts for order. The mementos were gavels and letter openers." This tree, in the grand, silent manner of its waning strength, secured order like prayer. To stand beside the distorted tree body, to pat its wrinkled skin, to throw your arms about its sacred body, and then to tell the story was a rememberable way to impress young folks gathered about that there lived a man like John Muir and that trees can do divine things. I do not know what we are going to do to accomplish these results, but I feel highly pleased that you remembered me with a portion of the flesh of this tree, shaped in the beautiful form of the gavel. I have placed the gavel on the shelf along with his books, with the silent prayer that the memory of the accomplishments of this great man and the accomplishments themselves will never go the way this tree had to go. Pretty powerful writing. Well, then, the date of publication of my book, and to me this is probably the most important element of the book. This in and of itself justifies all that effort in producing a book on Wisconsin's famous and historic trees. I took to Walter the first book off the press. Walter Scott, a man who was my mentor, who inspired me, who himself inspired by John Muir. Walter had just had another stroke. He had lost his ability to hear altogether. He was just a shell of the man that he used to be. He could still speak, however, with the help of his wife, Trudy. He was able to modulate his voice enough so that she could really understand what he was saying. And my co-author, Betty Durbin, and I went into his house, Hickory Hill House, near Spring Harbor in Madison, and sat down, and I gave Walter a copy of this book. And it was an important moment. All that effort that he had put into this, and all the effort that I put into this, it was almost a passing on of the torch. A confirmation that what he had done earlier was worth that effort. He took it, tears were in his eyes, and I'm not ashamed to say that tears were in my eyes. And he then asked his wife Trudy to get something for me in the other room. And she brought out this, which I don't think anyone except us and those who knew the story of the John Muir Locust and the mementos that were made from that would understand the significance of this. But as I passed Walter the book, he passed to me the memento that was carved from the wood of the John Muir Locust and given to him by E.B. Fred and Walter Rowlands as a special memento of a very special tree and a very special idea, and asked that I might also hold on to it and perhaps at some point pass it on to others. And for the moment, I'm going to let you all see what it is, touch the wood of the John Muir Locust. And let me just tell you one more event that, it's funny, one thing leads to the other. I wrote a story about this for one of the Madison newspapers, and I received a call shortly thereafter from Mrs. Walter Rowlands. I had no idea that she was still alive, the widow of Walter Rowlands. And she said, "Bruce, I have some things for you that I think you would appreciate." So I went over to her house immediately and discovered, number one, some more wood from the John Muir Locust. She said also Walter would receive from all over the world pieces of wood from famous trees, and that he unfortunately died of a heart attack in his woodworking shop in his basement before he was able to really use all of these things. And one of the things that he received from the campus at Cornell was wood from the Joyce Kilmer oak, the oak that inspired Joyce Kilmer to write the now famous poem Trees. So as an interesting adjunct to this, but also I think it emphasizes the interconnectedness of the world, is some wood, which we had carved into a oak leaf from the tree that inspired Joyce Kilmer to write the poem Trees. And I'm a firm believer after all of this that trees indeed can do divine things. The final story, and somebody said, well, gee, here's a species that many people consider to be an absolute weed. Well, Walter Scott's box elder is not a weed. John Muir's locust is not a weed. When John Muir's daughter came to Wisconsin, was it his daughter or granddaughter? If I got that right?
I think it's daughter.
The daughter came for one of the, granddaughter came. She wrote a letter to Walter Rollins, who was still alive at the time, who gave her some wood from the John Muir locust. Thank you very much for this memento. Now I understand why my grandfather, at every one of his homesteads, the first tree that he would plant would be a black locust tree. Thank you very much. Well, I do want those mementos back.
Thank you for not only wonderful anecdotes, but very moving stories. The next speaker is Ed Schofield, who I have just had the pleasure to meet, but talked on the telephone and had voluminous correspondence with over the past 6 months. And Ed he's from Situate, Massachusetts. He has had a considerable amount of effort put into the Walden Pond and Walden Woods preservation program to try to save Walden Woods from what sometimes appears to be inevitable development. And so far, he and his group has been successful in stemming the tide so that condominiums not yet rear their heads above Walden Pond. Ed has a PhD in botany from Ohio State University, and until recently was the editor and rehabilitator of the magazine of the Arnold Arboretum, Harvard's Arboretum in Boston. And his topic today is connections, John Muir's Yankee friends and mentors. And I might say that it was his article in the Pacific Northwest Historian that taught me more about John Muir and his Yankee connections and a lot of the basis for transcendentalism more than I'd ever known before.
Thank you. I just turned around the last slide and I think they'll be in row.
Don't count them.
Yes, I think they'll open up.
You're just out of focus.
I hadn't had a camera for almost 20 years, and the week after I got it, I was in a car accident, and so I don't have as many slides as I wanted. Also, the developer was my local drugstore and didn't do a very good job. The story I have to tell is so long and complicated that I can only skim off the top of it. And as a device for tying it together, I want to describe the trip that Henry Thoreau made to Minnesota in 1861 to see whether he could regain his health. He spent 3 months on the trip, went to Minnesota because it was dry, to see whether he could recover from the tuberculosis that he was suffering from. It was unsuccessful, and he went back to Concord and died within a year. This is a kind of symbolic device, and I focus on Thoreau, but there were many other Yankees, many other New Englanders who influenced John Muir. We've already heard about Jeanne Carr, and I would say that Jeanne Carr, at least on the personal level, was the most influential person in Muir's life, the most influential Yankee in her life. But I would like to read the names of some of the Yankees I've identified as people who influenced John Muir in one way or another. Louis Agassiz, Luther Burbank, James Davy Butler, Ezra Carr, although he was born in New York, I guess you could call him a Yankee. Jeanne Carr, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Asa Gray, the great botanist, George Perkins Marsh, James Marsh, the cousin of George Perkins Marsh, Catherine Merrill of Indianapolis, whose family came from New England, Frederick Law Olmsted, who was probably the first person to become involved in trying to preserve Yosemite, Charles Sprague Sargent, who was the first director of the Arnold Arboretum where I used to work, John Swett, who was Muir's friend and neighbor, Henry Thoreau, and there are other names on the list that have more tenuous connections with Muir, but the list is impressive, it seems to me. One of the interesting things is the cultural background from which Thoreau and Muir came. Thoreau came out of New England. He was growing up at a time when Unitarianism was coming to the fore, when the old Orthodox Trinitarian theology was breaking down. And Muir himself was a Calvinist, was brought up in a Calvinist home. In other words, their religious heritage was Calvinism, and it seems to me that they were both, in a sense, rebelling against this strict Orthodox view of the world. But if we take a list, for example, Englanders, they are Yankees. A word that is sometimes used in derision. Now, a Yankee is many things. The word Yankee means different things to different people. Now, I don't mean that a Yankee is all things to all people. He could never be that. In fact, to most people, a Yankee may be and may mean very little, which suits him just fine. No doubt this shrewd, quirky, gangling, tow-headed, narrow-headed, shifty-eyed, big-nosed, supercilious, penny-pinching provincial outlander has always been perceived as more than a little mean, and no less odd, wherever he traipsed. Indeed, the word Yankee may derive from the Dutch Jan Keza, John Cheese, a term of derision applied by the New Amsterdammers in what's now New York to those odd sticks from down east. You would have thought that the Dutch Calvinist would sympathize or empathize with the New England Calvinists, but Calvinists don't empathize with each other. Now, there are Yankees and there are Yankees, and not all were, by any means, or are transcendentalists. To understand fully the role New Englanders played in John Muir's development, we must first define the term Yankee. When American troops swept onto the beaches of Normandy 4 decades ago, all were thought of as Yankees or Yanks by the French whom they were about to liberate. Among the troops, however, an important distinction almost certainly was made. Troops from the South were not, strictly speaking, Yankees. Troops from the North were. Among the Northerners, a further distinction, no doubt, was made. A Yankee was anyone from New England. Among the New Englanders, there was an even finer distinction, perhaps only implicit. A Yankee was a Vermonter. Vermonters know better. Among Vermonters, I have heard, a true Yankee must hail from the region east of Burlington. There, east of Burlington, however, only those who eat apple pie for breakfast may call themselves Yankees. This leaves state of Mainers out, Downeasters, because they eat mince pie for breakfast. I once asked a Vermonter who hailed from the country east of Burlington whether a true Yankee was someone who ate apple pie for breakfast. With a knife, he replied. Now you should remember that. With respect to Thoreau's trip to the West, when he called it his journey west. And it's interesting to me that the first essay of Thoreau that was published after his death was called Walking. And I would like to explore the essay Walking and then perhaps get into some of the details of the trip and try to indicate the various levels on which this symbol of the connection between Thoreau and John Muir works. the various interconnections on various levels. There's a poem by Wordsworth called Stepping Westward. What, are you stepping westward? Yea, 'twould be a wildish destiny if we who thus together roam in a strange land and far from home were in this place the guests of chance. Yet who would stop or fear to advance, though home or shelter he had none, with such a sky to lead him on? This is from Wordsworth's Memorials of a Tour in Scotland. Now these are the words that Henry Thoreau originally wrote in his essay, Walking, in the first draft. Wordsworth, on a pedestrian tour through Scotland, was one evening, just as the sun was setting with unusual splendor, greeted by a woman of the country with the words, "What, you are stepping westward?" And he says that such was the originality of the salutation, combined with the associations of the hour and place, that stepping westward seemed to be a kind of heavenly destiny. Now Thoreau uses quotation marks here. He alleges to be quoting Wordsworth, but the original words are, "'Twould be a wildish destiny." Thoreau throws in the word, "'Twould be a heavenly destiny." The sentences from my journal, which I am going to read this evening, for want of a better rallying cry, may accept these words, stepping westward. I feel that I owe my audience an apology for speaking to them tonight on any other subject than the fugitive slave law, on which every man is bound to express a distinct opinion. These words were penned in 1851. But I trust that something which I shall say will concern you. I wish to speak a word now for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, as contrasted with a freedom and culture simply civil. Now this was the first draft of the beginning of the essay that became known as Walking, the first essay published when, after Thoreau's death, it appeared at the end of May 1862. Thoreau died at the beginning of May. It appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. Here are the words as they appear. Here is the beginning of the essay as it was published. I wish to speak a word for nature. See, he completely eliminates reference to Wordsworth. But because we have that draft, we know what he was up to. I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil, to regard man as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of nature, rather than a member of society. I wish to make an extreme statement. If so, I may make an emphatic one, for there are enough champions of civilization. The minister and the school committee and every one of you will take care of that. I have met with but one or two persons in the course of my life who understood the art of walking, that is, of taking walks, who had a genius, so to speak, for sauntering, which word is beautifully derived, according to Thoreau, from idle people who roved about the country in the Middle Ages and asked charity under the pretense of going à la Sainte Terre, to the Holy Land, till the children exclaimed, "There goes a saunterer, a Holy Lander." I won't read the whole passage, but toward the end of the introduction to this, he says, the first part of Walking, "Some months ago I went to see a panorama of the Rhine. It was like a dream of the Middle Ages. I floated down its historic stream in something more than imagination. There were panoramas that were shown in theaters in those days. They were unrolled, they were massive things. Someone had painted scenery of the Rhine. I floated down its historic stream in something more than imagination. Under bridges built by the Romans and repaired by later heroes, past cities and castles whose very names were music to my ears, and each of which was the subject of a legend. There were Ehrenbreitstein and Rolandseck and Koblenz, which I knew only in history, They were ruins that interested me chiefly. They were ruins that interested me chiefly. There seemed to come up from its waters and its vine-clad hills and valleys a hushed music, as of crusaders departing for the Holy Land. I floated along under the spell of enchantment, as if I had been transported to an heroic age and breathed an atmosphere of chivalry. And now, what you will see is germane to the subject. Soon after, I went to see a panorama of the Mississippi, and as I worked my way up the river in the light of today, and saw the steamboats wooding up, counted the rising cities, gazed on the fresh ruins of Nauvoo, beheld the Indians moving west along the stream, and as before I had looked up the Moselle, now looked up the Ohio and the Missouri, and heard the legends of Dubuque and of Winona's Cliff, still thinking more of the future than of the past or present. I saw that this was a Rhine stream of a different kind, that the foundations of castles were yet to be laid, and the famous bridges were yet to be thrown over the river. And I felt that this was the heroic age itself, though we know it not, for the hero is commonly the simplest and obscurest of men. That's the beginning of the first part of walking. The beginning of the second part is very well known. The west of which I speak is but another name for the wild. And what I have been preparing to say is that in wildness is the preservation of the world. Now, as I say, the story is very complicated. This of his trip west, he started out from the town of Concord, going west on the Fitchburg Railroad, changed trains, and went down to Worcester, where his friend Harrison Blake lived. He stayed overnight to make the connection to go west on the Western Railroad, as it was called at the time. The orange line is his trip west. What I have shown up here is his return leg with two alternative routes. And the one that I determined he did take is this one, which brought him through the city of Lowell. Next, please. He left Concord on May 11th, 1861, when the oaks were just coming into bloom. This was taken in the town of Ayr, where he changed his trains, and I apologize for the washed-out look of the slides, but this was the stage of the oaks when he was beginning his trip west. The next slide, please. See, this is the miserable little town of Ayr. The railroad still runs, passengers can still take it, but he would have gotten off about here and taken the track that heads, you can barely see it, but through the waiting area you can see the track that heads down south toward Worcester. You can see what the developer did to the sky here. Next, please. I followed the track down through the little town of Harvard, because when I wrote my article for the Pacific Historian, I had used a lot of maps, and I had not been in these sites, and I calculated that he would have been able to see, for example, Bronson Alcott's Fruitlands. Thoreau would have, when on his way from Ayr to Worcester. Bronson Alcott's Fruitlands was one of the, like Brook Farm, which you might know of, a utopian community, a manifestation of the transcendentalist view that people can be improved, that society can be made perfect. Next slide, please. And this is what you can see from the train. This is taken from the track. That's Fruitlands, the house in which Bronson Alcott lives, about 300 feet from the track. The next slide shows the house from the front. It's now a museum. You can go in. There are Thoreau memorabilia and so forth. He went from there to other towns that have significance, but as I say, I don't have the time to tell you about them. The next slide, please. This is the track to Worcester. Next. Through some beautiful country, Mount Wachusett, which meant a lot to him. Next slide, please. Now in Worcester, here's where he got off the train. I couldn't resist including the money machine here. The depot was here, where he got off, and he would have walked from here up to Blake's house, which is, I believe, is shown on the next slide. Not the house, but the site. It was taken down in the 50s, but I have a picture from the newspaper I must have looked rather strange that Sunday, climbing up on walls and so forth, going through this neighborhood. He spent that Sunday in Worcester, walked around what's called Lake Quinsigamond, or rode around with his friend Blake, because by that time he was sick. And then the next morning started out for the west on the railroad. Next slide. I don't know if there is another one. But as I say, he started out in Worcester, went through New York State, passed over into Canada. This, by the way, is the return route. Next slide, please. Here it is. I traced it on my way out here to attend this meeting because I wanted to be able to say that I had done it. He crossed over here, at Niagara Falls, into southern Ontario, and came over into Detroit. Next, please. Here is the entire route. Niagara Falls, I've circled that because some of these routes are what John Muir took, and this is the interesting thing. The interplay of the routes that Thoreau and Muir took in the Midwest. When John Muir went to Canada, he came up from Wisconsin. I believe he took the train and then walked much of the way. He went to Niagara Falls, and his brother met him there, and he did some botanizing for some time. Thoreau and Horace Mann Jr., the young person who accompanied him to help him, spent 5 days botanizing at Niagara Falls on Goat Island. Now, Thoreau made the trip in 1861. Muir was there, I believe, in 1864, the spring of 64 probably. Then Thoreau went on from Detroit, by way of Chicago, over to the Mississippi, to the very place that he describes in this essay, walking. I thought, he added this to the essay after his trip west, but it's in the early drafts, this panorama of the Mississippi. It's almost prophetic, his trip, and he entitled this talk, The Journey Westward. They got off at what's now East Dubuque, Illinois, took a ship up the Mississippi to St. Anthony Falls near Minneapolis, spent over a month there, also took another boat up to the Sioux Reservation where they saw the U.S. government paying the Sioux tribe its annual payment. And then they came back down to Prairie du Chien on the return trip in late June. They went to Minnesota, by the way, because it was supposed to be dry and good for one's health. And they came up they got the railroad, they came up through Madison on June 27th, 1861. And the schedule says that the train would have been in Madison about 1:30 in the afternoon. Then they went to Milwaukee, took a boat up to Mackinac Island, came down here to Ontario, and back here through Vermont to Boston by way of Lowell, according to Horace Mann's letters to his mother home, and back to Concord from Boston, arriving in Boston on the same train, so to speak, that had taken them out exactly 3 months to the minute after they arrived, after they had left. And it was July 11th when they got back. It was the day before Thoreau's last birthday. The next slide, please. This shows where the train came through Madison, and when my Stockton talk was written up in the Sierra Club's magazine, my name was not used, but the reviewer said that someone had the fanciful story that as Henry Thoreau was coming through on his way to Madison, he probably looked out over Lake Mendota and saw John Muir returning to Portage on the 27th of June, 1861. I like to think of that as a symbol. The reason it works. But the point is, John Muir had just finished his first semester at the university. June 26th was commencement. Commencement ended at 9 that night. He would not have started walking back to Portage in the middle of the night, I don't think, not even John Muir. So he would have started walking back after his first semester at the university on the very day on which Henry Thoreau and Horace Mann came through on their way back to New England. Now I ask, what are the chances that this is only one of the countless strange kinds of coincidences I have found about this trip that Thoreau took on his journey west, his journey west. What are the chances that John Muir, who had been identified, let's say by Roderick Nash and other people, as John Muir, who had been influenced by Emerson and Thoreau, would have been in Madison at the same time that Henry Thoreau was passing home to die. In other words, John Muir's career was beginning at almost exactly the same time that Henry Thoreau's career was ending. The next slide, please. I had to add on this one I'll quickly describe the trips that John Muir took. After his eye injury in Indianapolis, he and a young fellow named Merrill Moores went back to Madison, and they spent some time in a house on the prairie, only a very short distance from where Thoreau mentions first seeing the prairie on his trip west. Muir botanized here up toward the railroad tracks. This was after, of course. This was 5 years after Thoreau came through. Then, before that, in 1863, Muir took a trip with two classmates down to the Mississippi, and they were originally intending to go to St. Anthony Falls, but they took a trip down to Wisconsin to the Mississippi, climbed some of the bluffs that Thoreau describes in his notes, and he was with two classmates, one named Blake, the other named Rice. Now, Harry Blake in Worcester was related to the Rices of Worcester County, and the Rice I found on my trip here to Madison, the Rice who was on the trip with John Muir was descended from the Rices of Worcester County, Massachusetts. I haven't been able to show that there was a direct relationship yet, but I be assured that I will, when I get back, ransack all the genealogies to find out. And you can see how their paths crossed in southern Ontario, of all places. Well, I have time for only one last coincidence in a way. By the way, I wanted to point out the importance of the state of Vermont. It wasn't only New Englanders, it was Vermonters. Vermont, for example, was the source of transcendentalism. George Perkins Marsh's cousin, James Marsh, was the person responsible for the introduction of transcendental ideas to New England. It was taken up by Emerson and Alcott and the others in Concord, and that's where what it is associated with, but it actually began in Vermont. George Perkins Marsh, by the way, George Perkins Marsh, not his cousin, was very much influenced by Thoreau and Emerson, and we have written proof of that. Now, I have to close here. As you know, Emerson visited Muir in Yosemite in 1871, let me think. I'm not aware that Ralph Waldo Emerson had any Vermont forebears, though I understand that one is buried there, nor that transcendentalists necessarily, or even of necessity, eat apple pie for breakfast. Perhaps apple pie for breakfast was so commonplace a usage as not to bear mentioning. In any event, the Venerable Emerson, taking advantage of the then recently completed Transcontinental Railroad, visited John Muir in Yosemite Valley in 1871, when Emerson was 68 and Muir 33, spending 6 full days there. As might be expected, Jeanne Carr, who at the time resided in Oakland, had engineered the meeting. Emerson was accompanied on his journey west by 11 other New Englanders who protected him and prevented him from staying out overnight with John Muir camping out. One of Emerson's travel companions, James Bradley Thayer, recorded the party's departure from Yosemite thus: on the next morning, May 11th, exactly 10 years to the day after Thoreau had begun his trip west, we left the Great Valley before 7 o'clock. At breakfast we had, among other things, pie. This article at breakfast was one of Mr. Emerson's weaknesses. A pie stood before him now. He offered to help somebody from it. who declined, and then one or two others who also declined, and then Mr. Blank, Thayer doesn't give his name. He too declined, but Mr. Blank, Mr. Emerson remonstrated with humorous emphasis, thrusting the knife under a piece of the pie and putting the entire weight of his character into his manner. But Mr. Blank, what is pie for? Well, as I said, Thoreau got back to Concord on July 11, 1861, and it was downhill from there. But John Muir, while he didn't see Thoreau when Thoreau passed through Madison that June, John Muir knew who Thoreau was, I'm convinced, as George has explained. Jeanne Carr almost certainly told Muir about the Transcendentalists. And Thoreau died on May 6, 1862. At the end of that month, the essay Walking was published, the first posthumous essay by Thoreau to be published of 4 that were to be published. Now, I feel as though I haven't been able to even skim the surface of the connections, concrete and intangible, between Muir and Thoreau. But I think the journey west that Thoreau took, his term, it works as a beautiful symbol of the way in which the flame was passed by Henry Thoreau to John Muir, how the ideas of Emerson and Thoreau were taken up by Muir and implemented in the West, in the wilderness. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. The next item, I think, proves the truly eclectic nature of this group. Robert Chapin and I share something very important. We both have breakfast at the same place, and I was immodest enough one day about 4 months ago, knowing that she was interested in writing, to hand her my article about Emerson and John Muir, etc. And she was kind enough to read it. And then, since she showed at least a spark of interest in something I had written, I then started telling her over the weeks and months to follow about this John Muir event that I was trying to put together. And one day in the campus mail, I got a little brown envelope, and in it was a poem entitled Wisconsin History Lesson, John Muir on a Hill in Marquette County, which was the first I had known that Robin had written this. One nice thing about poets is that they don't need slides to illustrate their talks. Their imagery is in the words, and therefore we look forward, and I look particularly forward to hearing Robin read this poem and others.
In that case, we can have some light.
Yes.
Well, I sent George the poem because after I heard the schedule for the conference, I so much wanted to come. And in truth, had been thinking about John Muir for over 20 years, beginning in my time in Berkeley and the places that Muir Wood and Yosemite that Muir had loved, and came to Madison to buy early in our career here a hill in Marquette County that turns out to be equidistant between Muir's 2 farms. And this poem comes from spending time on the hill and reading his autobiography. And then I have, I think, 6 other poems that are poems of places Muir has been and been interested in. This first one is called Wisconsin History Lesson, John Muir on a Hill in Marquette County. John Muir walked across this hill when he was a boy, bones aching from digging out oak grubs or hollowing out the cramped, damp well 50, 70, 90 feet down, day after day, until the neighbor noticed that no more buckets were coming up and hauled him out just before the oxygen gave out. head aching from his father's grim message, "You're no good, boy, no good unless you work. The only salvation from our evil nature is prayer and work. Reading and education are the devil's temptation." Eyes aching from reading at 3 a.m., catapulted out of bed and sleep by a contraption of wooden scraps to the wooden desk that turned the pages like clockwork, 20 minutes a book. It's still on display at the Historical Society. Years later, heart aching, he walked away from the education that wasn't the answer, walked away from a Yosemite sawmill and a woman who wasn't his, walked home to Wisconsin once when he imagined his mother dying, but walked most of his life toward the high Sierras, Yosemite's upper reaches, the Grand Canyon, toward the views that stunned the heart into forgiveness or forgetfulness and peace. Talked Teddy Roosevelt into leaving all those views to the nation. His own salvation foreshadowed in the aching boy seeking some ease, watching and walking through the Marquette County trees, the light shining through the leaves. These next two are poems from the same hill, and the first is called Prairie Restoration. One by one the prairie species come, fill every niche of time and light, their names spill into poems on the tongue, liatris, aster, deedlegrass. We watch the wash of Renoir's colors through the blue-stem grass, the herons sweeping home. In evening light, the junipers could almost be bison gently grazing. And this, another part of the hill, is called Sand Barren. Flat on your stomach for a day, you'd see catchfly sleeping, Venus looking in her glass, the slow opening and closing of earth stars, ladies' tresses nodding to the hog-nosed snake who slides past the deer's double indentations, loosening the grains of sand on the hoofprint's lip. In dreams, you'll see the avalanche. And this, out of airy nothing, a wind comes up. One silken parachuter after another pulls its milky ripcord, revolves through October light, goes down in thistle territory. Next season, monarchs among the finches. And now the place shifts to the marsh back on the University of Wisconsin campus. I suppose Muir might have gotten this far back into the woods, but this is its contemporary version, called What Can Happen. Wrung back from rubble, from the asphalt shadow of tall buildings thundering down, this fragile fragment of wetland past gives back a nursery of dreams, trust in the wisdom of what can happen when, left to themselves, land and water meet and mix, expand, contract. How each different rooted thing chooses along the muddy gradient the conditions of its growth. How this wild diversity of flower, stem, leaf gives shelter to turtles, ducks, small fish. How each feeds each and tempers the wind in the world sprung up. What can happen at a permeable boundary? And this too by the University Marsh. Only the words disconnect the blue sky from the half-moon marsh, you from me, the hickory maple woods hanging between in the glass of memory. Always you will be running to the point through lake wind, tall trees. I will be looping the marsh, past mallard and muskrat house, wild grass. Every step gives back the intricate connection of water, ground, and air through which we passed. And this last, westward to Utah, is called Mount Timpanogos. We hike toward the snow line in thin blue air. Water falls and falls, one switchback to the next, and the narrow trees toe their narrow footholds. We can see mountains for miles, green falling away, and coming close, the red granite face of Timpanogos, whose rocky presence in the sun makes and unmakes the one white cloud that glows and thins and disappears in the great blue bowl of sky. We pause for breath among glittering leaves to see a marmot up ahead, listen a moment, flick his tail, and vanish as a piercing trill cuts the sky, echoes across the mountain rim, plummets toward us in humming dive, one ruby-green flash shrilling ownership, stopping suddenly a foot away to claim a scarlet bugle flower. His wings scull air too fast for our eyes, hang him there or up or back, half his body beating heart, as though pure thought could move when called by those red throats. Unsheathing his long doubled tongue deep into the flower, he picks an insect there, wicks nectar, and is gone. Again the sky fills with that same urgent note, the one cloud unraveling above our heads.
Thank you. That's a treat. I think we should all take just maybe a 5-minute stretch break, and then we can get on to the second part of the program. Papers are kept, and fortunately, they had told me when I went to the Pasadena Historical Society to make a business trip to Los Angeles tolerable. I figured I must get something of value out of this trip, so I went to the society to look at some of the Jeanne Carr material. And they told me, oh, there are 2 women who are working on a book on Jeanne Carr. And I was absolutely flabbergasted, and I said, well, who are they? And the librarian very discreetly said, well, I can't really tell you. That's confidential information. I said, well, would you be willing to tell one or both of these women that I'm interested in Jeanne Carr? I'll give you my name, which she did, and then very enthusiastically got in touch with Grace, and through her, we made a connection. And again, the eclectic nature of all this, Grace is a historian. She is retired as professor of history, was dean of the faculty at Holy Name College in Oakland, got her PhD in history from Columbia, and I'm sure we will hear more now and later today about the book that she is putting together around Jeanne Carr's life and friendships. And the talk of her talk this afternoon is entitled Jeanne Carr, the Miracle in Pasadena.
My consciousness of Jeanne Carr dates from the mid-1950s when I was working with Professor Emeritus Henry E. Erdman at the University of California on a history of California's agricultural marketing cooperatives. He liked to talk about marketing, about farm movements and about farm leaders, and he liked to talk about the origins of the Department of Agricultural Economics, where he worked, and the College of Agriculture of the university. He had come to Berkeley to teach from Madison about 1920, so he had many memories. In our discussions, Ezra Slocum Carr, Jean's husband, was a topic of interest not only because he served as the first professor of agriculture and head of the university's College of Agriculture from 1869 to 1874, but because his dismissal from this position remained even in 1950s as a very controversial topic. Our work gave us occasion to use the records that the Carrs had gathered and published in 1875 on the Granger movement of the Pacific Coast, a movement that they had both helped to shape. They both had lectured to farmers to encourage them to form membership in the Patrons of Husbandry. They wrote articles on the Grange, and Jeanne Carr served in remarkable positions in the California State Grange. She was elected by the entire State Grange constituency to be the chaplain of the State Grange from 1877 to 1879, and that was followed by, more unusual even, her election to the position of lecturer of the State Grange, which meant that she traveled up and down the state to give lectures on various occasions to the subordinate Granger groups. Beyond these introductions to Mrs. Carr, her name turned up from time to time in other agricultural literature, particularly in the pages of the Pacific Rural Press. She was a regular correspondent of that excellent journal. Many, many years later, by 1980, I encountered her again when starting a project to recycle myself for teaching after a period of college administration. The research project deliberately involved practicing the so-called new approaches in history. This amounted to working on formerly overlooked or neglected subjects, and in letting the people who were part of the story reveal their importance through their various modes of self-expression. The tag attached to this methodology is called using expressive culture. My project was to learn from rural women in California themselves about their role in the development of the state's agriculture. I have become very much involved in this topic as a dominating interest because I have learned that unless somebody puts the women in the picture, they're never going to be there when the history of the state's remarkable agriculture is written. But unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know how to say which, it's Jeanne Carr who has caused me to spend more time on her than anticipated. While I was looking through the Carr collection in the Huntington Library at San Marino in California, I chanced upon a handwritten and very charming essay by Helen Hunt Jackson. It was called One Woman and Sunshine. Jeanne Carr was the woman, although she was not identified by name in this manuscript, nor in the published article published posthumously the year after it was written, but in 1886. The development by Jeanne Carr of her ranch during the years 1877 to 1885 was the subject of Mrs. Jackson's essay. She acknowledged that she was merely outlining the work and presenting not the biography of what she called the skilled landscape engineer, nor was she offering a catalog, a horticultural manual, as she listed the numerous and wide variety of plantings on this ranch. Suffice to say, for the moment, that she did arouse a wish for a more detailed version in her excellent word picture of Jeanne Carr. Hinted at by Mrs. Jackson and substantiated later by Jeanne Carr, the ranch came into being as it did because Jeanne Carr realized when she was 52 years old in 1877 that in view of her husband's precarious health, she needed to earn the family's living. For this purpose, she turned to land in the newly founded orange-growing community in the newly formed town of Pasadena, on land originally intended for the couple's retirement. She took advantage of the circumstances to work toward two other goals. One was to implement her firmly held and widely publicized ideas on industrial or practical education, especially for women. It was her mission for many years to make sure that women had the opportunity to earn a living and thus to enjoy independence and to reach the full status of which they might be capable. And she thought women had a particular affinity for land, provided they had the education to know what to do with it. She promoted as much as she could the idea of a public university for women to give them this opportunity. But she felt on her own ranch she would teach horticulture using her gardens and orchards and vineyards and the small forest that she established there. These would be her outdoor laboratory. After the students had studied under her, they would then be prepared to start earning at that point their own incomes in enterprise that was noble and enjoyable and very useful. The second goal that she had in mind was to establish experimental grounds in horticulture and forestry. In this pioneering era of the state's agricultural development, the State Grange as well as the University Department of Agriculture under Ezra Carr's successor, Professor Eugene Hilgard, pushed for experimental farms or centers or stations as they were called. And in Hilgard's case, of course, they would be under university supervision. The idea was to have, as he said in a speech before the State Grange, an annual meeting, several such experimental farms scattered through the state in order for them to gather data on what crops might be grown most effectively with highest returns in various regions. This would be important given the enormous variety in the state's soils and climate. Well, immediately after he sat down, after a very long, very enthusiastic speech on behalf of encouraging the development of these experimental stations, Jeanne Carr brought her land under cultivation with an eye to aesthetic effects as well as to commercial utility. She insisted upon planting her fruit trees so that not only would they bring monetary returns, but that as they blossomed, one could gaze at the different hues. It was very important to her which blossoms appeared at which times and how the whole effect would result from the way they were planted. She also objected to the usual use of rectangles in landscaping and had winding paths, and in every way possible tried to make the ranch a very enjoyable place in terms of visual appearance. She also, much to her neighbors' wonder and head shaking when she first started her ranch, first planted pine trees. As she said with some considerable humor, she wanted those trees to whisper to her as she engaged in this work. Her students, under her guidance, engaged in the experimental process of taking the harvested products, processing the fruit and packing the fruit to see what their possible commercial advantages would be. Again, one must be reminded that these were experimental days. People didn't know on California farms what would sell, where, under what circumstances, what would be most appreciated what the market was all about. They had to sound out the market, but before they could do that, they had to have the products that might appeal. Well, she called her branch Carmelita, or Little Grove, and it represented indeed an impressive physical and artistic achievement. Helen Hunt Jackson started that little essay depicting a diminutive character figure standing on the seat of a Studebaker wagon, map in hand, sketching out where she was going to plant all of her trees and shrubs and flowering plants, her precious pines, cypress, and so on, and also where she eventually planned to place her house. When she gazed thus out over this landscape, these 43 acres, in 1877, as Helen Hunt Jackson depicted the land, one could only say that it was wilderness or wild land. It had been a grazing place for sheep, and it had been burrowed by gophers and rabbits, and it was almost entirely infested with tarweed and mustard. If you can imagine that kind of land that this small creature changed virtually with her own hands into Carmelita, you have a sense of what one woman in sunshine managed to do. Within a few years from the earnings of the crops and money received from the sale of one of her acres, which appreciated in value in 5 years from the original $75 an acre to $1,500, she started construction of a handsome redwood home. It was said at the time to have been the most magnificent one in the Pasadena community. As with the planting, she designed her home to accommodate her students. When the family had moved permanently to Pasadena in 1880, they moved into a very rough barn-like structure. But Jeanne Carr was not content to leave it an ugly edifice. She camouflaged it with showy vines, and people raved about its attractiveness, even that little place. Her gardens were so beautiful that though she lost the farm in 1892, the gardens remained in place and became a public garden enjoyed by countless numbers of tourists. Eventually, with the progress of road construction, even this area disappeared, and this represented the last remnant of the farm days of the city of Pasadena. Now on the spot or site of the former Carr Ranch is the Norton Simon Art Museum. Of all the homes that Jeanne Carr had, she claimed that the home in Pasadena was her favorite. Like the others in Castleton and Albany and Madison and Oakland, this home attracted countless numbers of creative artists, of performers, of intellectuals. Indeed, the list of artists, poets, musicians, writers, scientists, actors, actresses, academicians, reformers, business people, and fellow farmers is a veritable directory of the notables of the era. Jeanne Carr served in the community of Pasadena and in the city area, large metropolitan area of Los Angeles, as she had served in all the communities where she had lived during her 50 years of marriage to Ezra Carr. In Pasadena, she joined many clubs, gave innumerable lectures, wrote newspaper and magazine articles, became a sponsor of and director of a new public library and historical society, She also took part in the planning of Troop University in Pasadena, which was the foundation of the California Institute of Technology, and served on its board of directors. When Mrs. Flora Kimball, a journalist from San Diego, wrote about Pasadena as the miracle of Southern California, she said that Jeanne Carr was a miracle in Pasadena, and one can not wonder that she would have said this. There were many, many others who knew Jeanne Carr well and benefited from their association with her, and many more who possibly learned about her through pursuing the careers of Jeanne Carr's associates, who had equally forceful, powerful words of comment upon the qualities of Jeanne Carr. In my own continuing research on her, I've learned to appreciate a sentence in the Helen Hunt Jackson essay that I must admit I quite overlooked in many of the early readings before I had pried into the records and found as much as I have accumulated on the life of this extraordinary person. Helen Hunt Jackson said in a toss-in sort of sentence in the midst of her short essay, "It will be a long time before there will arise another prophetess and priestess combined of nature's worship and work." If I have suggested or hinted that not much is known about Jeanne Carr and that she is unsung, then it was with great intention. She lies buried today, her remains do, along with the body of her husband and 3 of their 4 sons in unmarked graves in the Mountain View Cemetery of Oakland, which, by the way, was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. As far as I have been able to discover, there isn't any historical marker for her in the city of Pasadena, despite her amazing contribution to the development of that city and area. There isn't even, for sure, a marker in Oakland of the home visited by the venerable Ralph Waldo Emerson when he said he couldn't live with himself unless he went back to her house and thanked her for the introduction to Jeanne Muir. She invited him in, but he said no, he had an appointment in San Francisco. Most people not only don't know about Jeanne Carr, but they have no idea that Ralph Waldo Emerson had ever been in Oakland. The story of Jeanne Carr obviously needs to be told. It awaits the telling, but as Helen Hunt Jackson said in her essay, and this is the last paragraph in that short essay, when the story is told, it will have to begin back many years in northern New England, where there was trudging all one summer through wood, forest, and meadow, a little maiden, only 7 years old, with her tin case and her blotting paper, already at that tender age an enthusiastic botanist. 700 species of plants the little creature collected in that one summer and pressed in a herbarium, which is still preserved as a chief treasure. Then and there...
The next talk, I think, typifies what we're all about.
Skip presentation by Frank.
I might try to find a link in what
Now on to the next presentation.
Part of it certainly is a concern for the land, for its conservation and preservation. And why are we all interested in history? Because of the continuity that we want to see happen in land and in the people. And I think the next talk, again, demonstrates this continuity of generations. The Wisconsin Wilderness Connection, Leopold and Muir, by Curt Meine, who has written the definitive biography of Aldo Leopold, who holds a PhD degree from the Land Resources Department at the University of Wisconsin, and very anxious to hear his talk today.
So am I. I also appreciate that
introduction as given because I'm going to take some great liberties with... Yes. First slide. I haven't seen these slides yet myself. Okay. But I won't be needing these right now. I can turn the lights on for a few minutes here. As I say, I'm going to take some liberties with the topic. With the topic as titled. I will talk for a few minutes about Leopold and Muir and the connections between them. Tenuous but real. Second thing I'll do is take a little trip west with you and show you some slides that I just, like I say, I haven't seen myself yet, but I think they turned out pretty well. And this relates back to your introduction. I think it will help us establish a little continuity here in a place very far away from Wisconsin, but close in spirit. And then I'll conclude with a few comments. First of all, we do meet in a rather interesting place. By place, I mean how far you want to define it. Within a 30 or 40 mile circle here, certainly Leopold and Muir, the connections between them are quite remarkable. And we might also throw in Frederick Jackson Turner, who was born in Portage, as many of you know, just south of here. It's always interesting to me when I've given talks on Leopold, one of the questions that always seems to come up in the question and answer session is, did Aldo Leopold and John Muir ever meet? And I'd say at least in 3/4 of all the talks I give, this question would come up. And it's a natural one to ask, since these two, along with Henry David Thoreau, are probably the triumvirate of great wilderness thinkers in American history. And there certainly is a meeting of minds there, if not of bodies. It's this relationship between the geography of this particular area and these ideas that continues to intrigue many historians, and myself included. And you'll note that in the book on Leopold that I wrote, that I gave it a definite geographical context here, and centered the last part of the book on Wisconsin, but used that to show how Leopold took what he learned from this area, from the Sand County area, to expand to generalities of global importance and continuing global importance. So, first of all, what relationship did Leopold and Muir have? So you won't have to ask me after I'm done. First of all, they were different in age. There are several generations difference. In fact, another nice little historical coincidence. I think it was 2 days separated the death of Leopold's father and John Muir in 1915. So Leopold was at least one generation younger. They never did meet in person, as far as I know, and I know that those years of Leopold's life pretty well. We have pretty good records on that, and I can pretty confidently say that they did not meet. However, Leopold was certainly well aware of Muir's work. I mean, that goes without saying almost. Leopold was, as many of you know, a very extensive reader, especially on conservation matters and especially in historical and history of landscapes. And so he would have come across Muir quite early in his reading. Leopold came of age and gained his conservation ethic in the early years of this century under the, especially during the tenure of Teddy Roosevelt in the White House. And it was during these early 1900s when a lot of Muir's works are, of course, coming out and being published in book form as well. And Leopold, as a true child of progressive conservation, would have imbibed all the voices of the day. Historians tend to look back on the dichotomy between Gifford Pinchot and John Muir as sort of setting the stage for the conservation and environmental movements as they have developed. Leopold was to hear both of these sides, and it's that tension between sort of the utilitarian approach to conservation and the more aesthetic preservationist side that would really give to Leopold the tension that drove him, and that drove him to new ideas and new ways of thinking and creating expression of his ideas about nature and how we should relate to it. The Park Service, of course, was created in 1916, just after Muir's death, and in fact, many have seen that as basically a tribute to Muir, a final tribute following his defeat over the Hetch-Hetchy controversy. And this was a time
shortly after World War I, and during the war when recreation became a much greater priority among professional conservationists. One of Leopold's chores in these days, when he was in the Forest Service, was to help the Forest Service get its recreational facilities up to gear, so as to keep the Park Service from raiding all those wonderful lands they had out west. And so during this time too, you will find in some of Leopold's writings references to Muir. Leopold used to keep notebooks, very detailed notebooks of what he was reading, favorite quotes from his readings. And a number of those you'll find Muir quoted, and I think in particular Muir's book, Our National Parks. That is the right title, I think. Leopold read that one quite carefully. And even as early as, I think it was 1913 or so, a famous quote, and I can't remember it offhand, in Muir about how even the despised rattlesnake has its place in God's heaven or something like this. Leopold quoted that one even as early as the teens. So you can see Leopold had quite a sympathy and an empathy really for Muir's viewpoint on conservation, even though he was at work within Pinchot's Forest Service. Leopold in 1921 published the first of a number of very major articles on wilderness preservation that would mark him as Muir's successor as the voice for the wilderness within conservation. There was a major difference, though, and that was that Muir found his fulfillment in the creation of the National Park Service. Well, in their 20s, as the Park Service was embarking on its crusade in building roads into all these wonderful wildernesses, it was Leopold who stepped forward from within the Forest Service and said, wait a minute, this isn't exactly what we had in mind. We want to preserve some of these areas from any development whatsoever beyond just the most necessary infrastructures for recreation. And so Leopold, from the years 1921 to about 1927, would publish six or seven articles which would really establish Leopold as the main progenitor of what became known as the wilderness idea. And it was, you could see, especially in these papers, Leopold drawing on Muir, and I might add on Frederick Jackson Turner as well. And I'll say a word about that a little later. After Leopold came to Wisconsin in 1924 to join the Forest Products Lab down in Madison, and even more so during his years as a professor at the university, he would continue to draw on Muir's work, sometimes quite explicitly. In his classes, Leopold's renowned class in wildlife ecology, he often had his students read The Story of My Boyhood and Youth because of its evocative descriptions of this area of Wisconsin at the time when it was in its true virgin state. And he would often have his class read that and compare it to what had happened in the years since. And of course, those of you who know St. County Almanac and the essay in particular, Good Oak, will recall Leopold's reference to the year 1865, I believe it was, as the birth date of concern for things natural and wild in Wisconsin, referring to Muir's attempt to get the Fountain Lake property set aside. And this whole Sand County area, of course, became the focus for Leopold's conservation activities after purchasing the property down along the Wisconsin River. And in fact, this area right here, the Endeavor Marsh, was quite a remarkable place for Leopold. It was here on this marsh that Leopold first spotted sandhill cranes in Wisconsin when there were only perhaps 20 or 30 of them left, breeders. And it was here that he first started really delving into the more detailed natural history of species and putting it in a paleontological context that he had never done before, this time scale and the way it grew and changed. One of the final connections, and there are many small ones, of course, when you go through correspondence and letters and manuscripts and things like this, you find them scattered throughout. But I think one of the most remarkable ones, and this is one I think I sent to Erik at one point, was a letter that Leopold wrote on April 14th, 1948. This was 1 week before Leopold died. It was also the very morning that his manuscript for the Sand County Almanac was accepted. He didn't know it by that name. He knew it as Great Possessions. That was the name of his manuscript at that point. But on that morning, he wrote a letter to a friend of his named Ernie Swift, who was, at that time, I believe, director of the Wisconsin Conservation Department, a good friend of Walter Scott's as well. And Leopold was writing to Swift in regard to the Muir property. And Leopold at that time was serving on a committee along with Norman Fassett, brilliant professor of botany down at the University of Wisconsin, and another fellow from Milwaukee whose name escapes me right now. And they were together serving on a natural areas committee, forerunner to a lot of the work done now by the Nature Conservancy, as a matter of fact. And in this letter to Ernie Swift, he proposed that we get together and start getting some activity going on trying to preserve one of the original Muir homesteads. And again, this was the very morning that the Sand County Almanac was accepted for publication. I remember when I put those two together, I said, wow. So that's sort of a very brief sketch of some of their connections. Of course, their truer connection is the connection of their ideas and their concerns and their devotion to conservation in its broadest and broadening sense. And it's with that I'm going to turn to these slides, which I hope have turned out very nicely. We'll see. Together we will see. I had the opportunity, we can kill this picture noise as well. I had the opportunity the week before last to visit Yellowstone National Park. I was out in Logan, Utah giving a talk on the history of wildlife conservation and took advantage of this to go up to Yellowstone since they were paying my way. And I wanted to see what the fires had done. So could be stretching a bit between Leopold and Muir and heading out west, but I think we can bring it back at the end. We'll try. This is Yellowstone Lake. Many of you who have been there will know this area. It's just breaking up out of its spring phase. This is the Grant Village, I believe. You can see that the ice really was just breaking up at this point. My main reason in going, of course, was to see the effects of what happened there last summer. As most of you, I'm sure, know, Yellowstone was subject to the greatest onslaught of wildfires that it had ever seen. And I'll be showing you some pictures of that. Maybe this will be the first time you've seen some of these. These were taken just a couple weeks ago. You cannot escape them. People ask me, did you see where the fires burned? I said, well, you can hardly avoid it. And here is just a sprig of a lodgepole pine, showing some of the light burn. It's quite a remarkable thing to see. I was very impressed by it. As I say, you can't hardly go anywhere in the park without seeing some degree of burning going on. And then this picture, this is towards the west entrance of the park. You'll see in the foreground, the bottomland forest there was virtually entirely consumed, where the slope fire above the talus slope was not. And you see the same thing, this various degrees of burning all over the place. Here on one side of the road you see a little heavier burning than on the right side. In the background you can see green, black, and brownish red, which are the three colors you'll see mostly at this time of the year, I guess. Again, this is my first visit, so this is all new to me. I took this picture because this is an older burn. This is a burn about 10 years old, and I wanted to contrast that with this, which took place last summer. And the most remarkable thing, of course, is the patchiness of it all. You see on the far left, it's completely green. The brown is where it burned up into the tops, but didn't completely consume them. The needles are still dying. And then it goes black, and then it goes almost pure white with ash. You can see you can really read the degrees of burning. You don't have to be an expert in fire ecology or forest ecology to know what was going on. Here again, you see the patchiness. I'll throw in a couple of these shots. The other thing here is, notice how thick that forest is, and it's a wonder to me why more of it didn't go up. As is, approximately half the park was burned, but a very small percentage of that was completely consumed. Again, various degrees, a whole spectrum of burning. This is an area that was burned quite lightly. You can see just towards the bottom of the trunks there. Again, lodgepole pines, but just the trunks and the duff were consumed. Goes on up the spectrum, up this particular slope I was on, where the entire slope did burn, including the sage. but that some parts of the upper trees were escaped the fires and so still live. According to topography and roads and other constructions, the fire took its own course. Here on one side, the left side again, it burned pretty totally, and on the right side, very thick stand of lodgepole pines. It was hardly even touched. Canyons will do the same thing. This is Gibbon Falls. Looking down the Gibbon River. Look at the modeling in the back again is the effects of the fire. Here's again another picture of that very classic pattern of patchiness in the burns. This was about the worst place. This was along the road north to Mammoth. You can see this entire, I would not have wanted to be near that fire. That virtually consumed the entire hillside. I think there's another shot here. This stump, again, that's about a 200 or 300 yard crossing there. And I couldn't see any way the fire got there. And that fire must have been quite hot enough to spontaneously combust some of these neighboring stands. Here's that whole hillside, just completely wiped out. And that's sort of the far end of the spectrum.
I kind of have a question about that. How similar are the new conical sequence in that area?
That's something Bruce could probably answer better than I, but, well, let me go on here. I think in a picture or two I'll help you answer that. Here, again, is you can see these fires are smoldering for months on end afterwards. They would get into the punky wood of some of these trees and just eat away at it as time went on. This is a picture of what was a stump. You can see it even burned down and burned into the roots. You'd see huge upturned roots completely eaten away. You can see where the major roots went out from the middle of the stump there. And here is the cones of the lodgepole pine. For those of you who don't know the lodgepole pine, it's sort of similar to our jack pine in that it has a certain ratio of serotinous cones, which means they don't open up until they are burned and heated to a high degree. And in some areas of these lodgepole pine forests, which was really the major component in most of these fires, hundreds of thousands of seeds have since fallen because of the opening of these cones. And there's going to be, in addition to a bumper crop of lodgepole pines, there's going to be a bumper crop of scientific studies coming out of this, because there's going to be more biologists out there studying this than shake a stick at. It's going to be very interesting to see how the different landscape features affect the comeback of the park. Here you have a north slope still covered in snow, as opposed to the foreground here, and the effects of that moisture and shade on various forms of regeneration will keep park visitors happy and interested, I think. It didn't much affect the wildlife, as I understand it. A couple bison and a few dozen elk were done in, but that was about it. They're doing quite fine in the lush new grass. The fires didn't consume, even when they did run across this rangeland, which they did. The grass comes quite well. Just having a good time, as far as I can tell. And the bison will do fine on some of the sage plains too, because the fires avoided a lot of the meadowlands in the park. Again, you can see even in the near background fires. Those aren't fires; that's a geyser basin. I forget the name of that one. They were doing some salvage work there, which surprised me. I didn't know they were allowed to do salvage work within the park, but they were in this particular stretch. And something to say about that in a minute too. I guess I'll conclude here. I have a few more minutes of slides here with just a few shots of at least some of the early recovery. This again was just after the snows had melted, and this stream here in particular was running just through essentially a pile of black ashes. There really is a certain beauty in it. The destructiveness was awful, and I heard some incredible war stories from firefighters and rangers. But there really is a beauty in what has been created there. And as I say, it was my first visit to this place. I went with no preconceived notions or no previous impressions. So this is the Yellowstone that I know so far. This one stand in particular was essentially coming back with these young, I think these are some kind of trout lily, if I'm not mistaken. So, I'm not sure. I don't know the flora out there. I don't know Wisconsin's as well as I should. I hardly know Yellowstone. But I'm glad my picture turned out. This is the final shot, again, giving you a really good view of the patchiness and the sort of transition that's going to go on there from a more or less even-aged standological pines to a really diverse, different aged forest, hopefully with some aspens coming in. It's really conspicuous when you're in Yellowstone that there are no aspens there. And I would expect to see some after these burns. That's just outside the north entrance coming in from the Gallatin Range. And that's a little look at Yellowstone. Bring us out of history and up to date. If I can have the lights for just a couple more minutes, just a few comments on why I wanted to show these and what this has to do with Leopold here, at least in my mind. The Yellowstone fires really brought into focus for a lot of people, especially in that area, many of the debates raging within conservation, and the debates are still raging. In the history of wilderness, the rationale behind wilderness preservation, you see a real sequence of ideas, starting with Muir, going through Leopold, and coming up to some of our more modern ideas. You see this movement away from just the idea that wild places are a great place to go and see and recreate in, that they have other meanings. And Leopold went through this sequence in his own life, in his own series of papers. He started off on that note, first pushing for the preservation of wilderness from a recreational standpoint. Later on, after he moved to Wisconsin, he began to stress more the historical significance and the drama of American history playing out in the wilderness setting. And this is very much a reflection of Frederick Jackson Turner's influence, whom Leopold lived 2 houses away from for a year or two in Madison. Later on, as Leopold gained his ecological education, he began to see that the wilderness was far more than just a place to go and play out American history, or even to go and just play, that it was also a place that had its own meaning and its own relevance to the way our civilization is going. And it's that question that still remains unanswered, and that is still the legacy of Muir and Leopold and all the others that we have quoted here today. And that is that we still have yet to learn a lot that the wilderness and wildness has to teach us. As an example, just a few quotes concerning the fires that stick in my mind. You'll remember perhaps during the midst of the fires, Governor Keene of New Jersey, one of our most environmentally active and devoted governors, offered to send, I think it was 50,000 Scotch pines to Yellowstone to help them replant it. This is coming from one of our most enlightened politicians. The fact that these were non-native species and that the park could regenerate itself just fine hardly occurred to him, I think. And again, this is one of our bright lights. I also came across a letter in the Billings, Montana paper, from a woman who was saying how the Yellowstone of her vision was gone. That the trees that she loved were gone, and the park would never be the same, and that her children would never have the chance to enjoy the park that she had loved so much. Which just says to me that we still have yet to learn that we are working with dynamic systems. That we are a dynamic system within a dynamic system, and that we still have to work to understand how to fit in with this to achieve that harmony between man and land that Leopold called conservation. And then again, there was a quote from a forester who decried the fact that they weren't able to go in and salvage some of this timber. There was a tremendous waste of resources laying there on the ground. The woodpeckers would certainly not agree. There's going to be more woodpeckers than we know what to do with out there. And finally, the news media's coverage of this certainly shows us we have much further to go. Last weekend, as a matter of fact, they had a meeting of the Yellowstone activists, and Tom Brokaw came out to give a big presentation on the media's role in covering it, and how they too are entirely susceptible to those big flashy pictures of the fires burning up everything. Well, as you can see, Yellowstone is still there, and it will be for much longer than we are, I suspect. These comments were really brought home to me by a chat I had with a fellow in the park. He's a fellow who stays there all winter and takes care of the buildings, pushing the snow off the roof. He said to me, "It's really, isn't it wonderful that we still have places where these elemental forces can still have free reign?" Now, he said this, and I admire him because those fires swept within at least 100 yards of his house. He had to get his wife and children out of there and go to work fighting those fires himself. So that's when we really test our wilderness convictions. And it's in that spirit, I guess, that I would say that we are still working on the tradition of Leopold and Muir, and many others, and many of us as well, that we still are trying to learn how are we going to fit into these places and what forces we do wish to retain in these places, because we could have stopped those fires perhaps if we wanted to. And these questions are going to keep rising again and again. And to see that mottled patchwork in the forest there after the fires came to me was a very inspiring thing. And I hope that the Park Service, as well as the Forest Service and many of the others, will take advantage of it and keep teaching us a little bit more about these ideas and this continuity that we're all part of. So, thank you.
Well, Curt helped me understand a little better how I can integrate my life, because I haven't been able to figure out how ophthalmology, taking care of retinal disease, which is what I do part of my life, can be reconciled with all these other interests and involvements. But as I watched the forest fire and the patchiness and the configuration of the scars, they are exactly like what we do to retinas with photocoagulation with lasers in order to save vision from diabetic retinal disease. Diabetic retinal disease looks like an engorgement, an overproduction of tissue, new blood vessels, and bleeding, contraction, and blindness. And what we do is we put in a series of scars, very much like the individual scars in the landscape, that is destructive and has always bothered me, because we're destroying the retina which we're trying to save, avoiding the central part. And it's that treatment which somehow, nobody understands how, quiets down the disease and retains vision. And it's an amazing analogy. Our next item is poems from Big Maple Springs by Louis Randall. And Louis Randall, by his own description, is a man who writes poetry, in addition to a great many other things, and a man who has a love for nature. Louis?
Thank you. The full quote was that, I guess I'd rather not go as a poet, but a man who now and then writes a poem, because if people begin to think of you as a poet, they're going to ask you for another one. And I can say, no, I'm working in my garden. Or I'm fixing my car. You know. So, sometimes I write poems. Now and then, and I mean sometimes, I let myself wonder if humankind as a whole can come to its senses, can create a collective good, or at least a collective truce. But as it is, if even one man or one woman comes fully to her senses, a following or a movement, or sometimes a whole age in that name begins. We're gathered today to honor the vision of John Muir. One man come to his senses. One man who could see, could hear, could feel with his own eyes and his own ears. And let us remember, as we revere his great name, that he began here as a little farm boy on the frontier, exactly as thousands of others in similar circumstances, in similar surroundings. And let us remember, as we honor him, that our need is not to see as he saw, or what he saw, or to hear as he heard, but to come to our own senses. Whatever sense I have come to, I try to record in poems and fiction. And inadvertently, a lot of nonsense, I know. And I'd like to read a few poems this evening and dedicate them, whatever sense may be in them, to the memory of John Muir and to the vision, our own vision, that he inspires. And I would like to think Muir might listen tonight and know what I mean. On seeing the wildlife art of Robert Bateman, no camera ever captured such fineness of detail, nor caught the wolf or eagle composed so still, so well. You have seen much of bark, yet not enough of trees. Too much of fur and feather, but not the thing that breathes. All nature looks domestic, frozen in your gaze, and no wind stirs or ruffles these exact and tame cliches. Wilderness reverie. In early June, when it was yet high spring at that latitude, two friends and I packed 10 miles from the car to reach the maple and whitebird shores of Lake Superior, cold blue, immense under the sun of a flawless afternoon. But as the sun dropped, thunder rolled off the water and vengeful clouds boiled overhead. While my friends donned rain gear and walked the stony beach in search of panoramas, arrangements of line and color suitable for the camera's lens, I retreated to my tent in the darkened woods and zip shut the outer door as the first drops fell. In the last light of dusk, the storm relented and the wind died away. Then I heard, deep in leaves, the hermit thrush this strange lyric sing. Oh man, we are not you, nor anything to do with you. Not for your ears do thrushes sing, but for ourselves alone each spring we repeat an old refrain, recalling how the dinosaur took wing, how the lemur grew your brain, and before these separate destinies, how rock sank under rain. My mind's dark eye remembers all. The first red bloom in single cell, continents vast of ancient palm, walls of cities that rose and fell. If you hear me now, what then? Long and long after you have gone, I shall sing on, I shall sing on. As the light died from the yellow nylon cloth separating me from the forest, the rain began again, drumming on the sides of the tent with greater force. Thunder shook the air, and bright bursts of lightning caused my thin shelter to glow with a brilliance that hurt my eyes. My friends came hurriedly, muttering and plashing into camp. By the side of the road, 3 riddles. Your vision magnified 5 times. From a snag on the elm I find traffic enough on the road below to fuel my rapid heart. In fence row, dooryard, and fallow field, by June I bloom in profuse galaxies, yet hold my skeleton stars against bitter nights in January. Cast in the ditch under thistle and vetch, I glare back at the sun for a year or so. Then bit by bit, I brown and go to the place where they first found me. And this one I'd like to dedicate, I guess, especially to Muir, because I think often of the difference between
his house. He had to get his wife and children out of there and go to work fighting those fires himself. So that's when we really test our wilderness convictions. And it's in that spirit, I guess, that I would say that we are still working on the tradition of Leopold and Muir. and many others, and many of us as well, that we still are trying to learn how are we going to fit into these places and what forces we do wish to retain in these places, because we could have stopped those fires perhaps if we wanted to. And these questions are going to keep rising again and again. And to see that mottled patchwork in the forest there after the fires came to me was a very inspiring thing. And I hope that the Park Service as well as the Forest Service and many of the others will take advantage of it and keep teaching us a little bit more about these ideas and this continuity that we're all a part of. So, thank you.
Well, Curt helped me understand a little better how I can integrate my life, because I haven't been able to figure out how ophthalmology, taking care of retinal disease, which is what I do part of my life, can be reconciled with all these other interests and involvements. But as I watched the forest fire and the patchiness and the configuration of the scars, they are exactly like what we do to retinas with photocoagulation with lasers in order to save vision from diabetic retinal disease. Diabetic retinal disease looks like an engorgement, an overproduction of tissue, new blood vessels, and bleeding, contraction, and blindness. And what we do is we put in a series of scars, very much like the individual scars in the landscape, that is destructive and has always bothered me, because we're destroying the retina which we're trying to save, avoiding the central part. And it's that treatment which somehow, nobody understands how, quiets down the disease and retains vision. And it's an amazing analogy. Our next item is poems from Big Maple Springs by Louis Randall. And Louis Randall, by his own description, is a man who writes poetry, in addition to a great many other things, and a man who has a love for nature. Louis?
Thank you. The full quote was that, I guess I'd rather not be billed as a poet, but a man who now and then writes a poem, because if people begin to think of you as a poet, they're going to ask you for another one. And I can say, no, I'm working in my garden. Or I'm fixing my car. You know. So, sometimes I write poems. Now and then, and I mean sometimes, I let myself wonder if humankind as a whole can come to its senses, can create a collective good, or at least a collective truce. But as it is, if even one man or one woman comes fully to his, to her senses, a following or a movement, or sometimes a whole age in that name begins. We're gathered today to honor the vision of John Muir. One man come to his senses. One man who could see, could hear, could feel with his own eyes and his own ears. And let us remember, as we revere his great name, that he began here as a little farm boy on the frontier, exactly as thousands of others in similar circumstances, in similar surroundings. And let us remember, as we honor him, that our need is not to see as he saw, or what he saw, or to hear as he heard, but to come to our own senses. Whatever sense I have come to, I try to record in poems and fiction. And inadvertently, a lot of nonsense, I know. And I'd like to read a few poems this evening and dedicate them, whatever sense may be in them, to the memory of John Muir and to the vision, our own vision, that he inspires. And I would like to think Muir might listen tonight and know what I mean. On seeing the wildlife art of Robert Bateman, No camera ever captured such fineness of detail, nor caught the wolf or eagle, composed so still, so well. You have seen much of bark, yet not enough of trees. Too much of fur and feather, but not the thing that breathes. All nature looks domestic, frozen in your gaze, and no wind stirs or ruffles these exact and tame cliches. Wilderness reverie. In early June, when it was yet high spring at that latitude, two friends and I packed 10 miles from the car to reach the maple and whitebird shores of Lake Superior, cold blue, immense under the sun of a flawless afternoon. But as the sun dropped, thunder rolled off the water, and vengeful clouds boiled overhead. While my friends donned rain gear and walked the stony beach in search of panoramas, arrangements of line and color suitable for the camera's lens, I retreated to my tent in the darkened woods and zip shut the outer door as the first drops fell. In the last light of dusk, the storm relented and the wind died away. Then I heard, deep in leaves, the hermit thrush this strange lyric sing. Oh man, we are not you, nor anything to do with you. Not for your ears do thrushes sing, but for ourselves alone each spring we repeat an old refrain, recalling how the dinosaur took wing, how the lemur grew your brain, and before these separate destinies, how rock sank under rain. My mind's dark eye remembers all. The first red bloom in single cell, continents vast of ancient palm, walls of cities that rose and fell. If you hear me now, what then? Long and long after you have gone, I shall sing on, I shall sing on. As the light died from the yellow nylon cloth separating me from the forest, the rain began again, drumming on the sides of the tent with greater force. Thunder shook the air, and bright bursts of lightning caused my thin shelter to glow with a brilliance that hurt my eyes. My friends came hurriedly, muttering and plashing into camp. By the side of the road, 3 riddles. Your vision magnified 5 times. From a snag on the elm I find traffic enough on the road below to fuel my rapid heart. In fence row, dooryard, and fallow field, by June I bloom in profuse galaxies, yet hold my skeleton stars against bitter nights in January. Cast in the ditch under thistle and vetch, I glare back at the sun for a year or so. Then bit by bit, I brown and go to the place where they first found me. And this one I'd like to dedicate, I guess, especially to Muir, because I think often of the difference between... No, it's not the same word. It isn't at all. And this is really about that difference, called Across the Street. Part 1. Across the street from the House of Beauty, where the gray matrons and crones of the town, poised like girls in the latest hats, sit composed in blonde, brunette, and black reveries, arranged behind plate glass, vein time blown back, quick as spring on the electric breeze of memory. Paintless, doors wide, windows smashed behind box elders brushing at the walls, the Clark House, first house built in the town, sits and sags, persistent as a Buddha, beholding with settled patience the noisy commerce of the street under the plastic Pepsi sign that says, Bob's Store. Part 2. Sunlight on the parlor wall, blanches a row of violets and roses beneath a strip of peeling green. Below, the spinet stands, impassive, upright in the trash. On his red tobacco can, Prince Albert, rusted, resolute in black, strides upon the upper keys, stern, as if he heard some hymn of hard, uncomplicated faith, in the meaning of forbearance, of virtue in a dour face. At his feet he does not see the coil of electrical wire that leads to the blank TV. In her mind, the roof rained tight. Beneath the shakes her father, cut by hand, still shelters the attic room and bed where she and a sister slept. As the century, turning in the dark overhead, fled at last, like a great night bird, stunned, myopic in the sudden glare. She never wed. Last heir. She sleeps 2 blocks down a side street, bearing her name, in a wheelchair, dreaming of the long day where girls run barefoot in the unpaved street, where slow wagons scarcely raise the dust. On sunny afternoons, her walls bloom like bright gardens. Is my 15 minutes up, Irena? All right. Am I reading too fast? Am I going too quickly? Requiem for You, 51 Mercury. Parked in this field at the edge of town. Stop forever in the weeds. Metal flaking to the ground, from which all bodies roll, shining down the fast lanes of time. Wheels locked up by rust, your green luster all gone to rust. Still you hug the arrogant curves of insolence and pride they had in mind when you were made, down finally now to pure design, smug, even in decay. Lighten up, they tell me, so sometimes I do. I try. Okay, let's get heavy. I love this one, I really do. I just finally finished it. I've just been sitting around longhand and fading a long time, and finally it made it to the typewriter. And so, because it's very recent, I love it best. It is called Meditation at Crete. It's a kind of shortcut sonnet, I guess. It lacks a couple of lines. If knowledge should grow tenfold tomorrow, and fact weigh heavier, more legion than stone, if from the furnace of the sun they borrow ships of fire to sail upon the dimmest star, and make the cell at last to yield, and minotaurs trot like dogs in the streets, and chimerae clash upon the battlefield, no nearer to your secret will they be. O water world, O rolling sea, but deeper, farther, starker in your mystery. Let's see, what's light? Jeez. They don't feel heavy when you write them, it's just when you send them and read them. I'm somewhat obsessed with time, and I've got some time poems here, if I can make sense of the disorder. Let's just go light with a Wisconsin narrative, Vilas County fish story. for Ellen and David. Walleye Daddy knows where the big ones go, to cool in the gloom, far below the sun-struck shallows where, torpid as oak, they lie during the long dog days after mid-July. How frowning, insensible, they settle to the bottom, long jaws locked, stomachs withered, cold brains, thoughtless, of crayfish, minnow, or leech. Walleye Daddy knows they go deep, and how sometimes in their sleep they dream of golden frogs or silver dragonflies. How now and then one lunges, the needled teeth impaling shadow. The way to get him now, he laughs, pupils enlarged, floating under bifocal glass, is dynamite. Then, lips pulled thinly back, incisors flashing in lower tones, he adds, there is another way just after dark. He moves quickly to the back of a battered, rusted Cadillac, opens the great dented trunk, packed to the fenders with long, stiff rods and spinning reels, and black boxes filled with chrome and brass and copper-plated lures of curved steel and painted plugs. Brilliant as October. From a little green metal case, he lifts a thing no bigger than a fly. A slender hook with golden ball for head. The lure of last resort, a jig, he said. Serious now, his white paunch hung over a beltless waist in smooth conviction, his point almost, if not already, won. This time of year they hate the sun and only wake at dusk. Not to hunt or feed, but just to breathe a thanks for waters dead of light. On certain cloudy nights they rise in meditation, floating near the shore. And though to you the lake looks black, the big ones in their trance each pebble see. Beneath and every dimple on the still surface above, that blank, unfocused gaze. I, man of 1,000 hooks, at least. For each one know 3 tricks. You can believe me when I say they will take this thing for a likeness of the sun and strike, not in hunger but anger. Swallowing imagined light in heedless rage, they think in one lunge to swallow the burning image of the sun. Or so to me it seems after years of observation. A patent, truthful explanation. This much I'm sure of, artificials work when bait won't get a touch. Well, you could lip hook a small perch behind the jig, but that's illegal. Like crawdads, if they won't hit a jig, try dynamite at dawn. One thing I can tell you, these lakes are full of fish. Just give it a try. You'll pull one out tonight, not up here at the bait shop and bar. Keep your line in the water. They're on the bottom now, waiting for cooler weather. Damn this heat. Good luck. Don't go away disappointed. Good luck. Good luck. Okay, Raina says 15 minutes. That's ended. I'll get the sheaf back together and make way for Erik.
Just before Erik tell us about Fountain Lake Farm and other related things, Ed Schofield has a brief announcement about some materials he has available on Walden Woods for anybody who's interested.
Well, what Curt said reminded me that I was told to bring some materials and reports we've written on our Walden Woods conservation plan. If anybody is interested, I have 3 copies of the plan and some propaganda for our organization. So just see me take
Almost exactly, I would say perhaps exactly 2 years ago today, I was in a hotel in Bath, England. There was a man there, an American, who was going to Spain, and I gave him the name of a hotel that I told him he must go to, which he loved. And in gratitude for my having turned him on to this place, he sent me a book in the mail. He said it was presumptuous to send me this book because he had written it. And it turned out to be the biography of John Muir. And the writer, the individual who I had met and didn't realize was a writer or a biographer, was Frederick Turner, who's written one of the really fine Muir biographies. Frederick Turner, in turn, did me a bigger favor. He gave Erik Brynildson's my name. And in the last year and a half, I've gotten to know Erik and to admire the work that he's doing. but I haven't yet learned how to spell his first name, and for that I apologize.
Or the title of the talk.
Or the title of the talk, which I guess was what I wanted, but maybe not what he told me.
Well, Louis, I still refuse to quit calling you a poet,
Well, go right ahead.
and a great one at that.
I write a few poems. Big deal. I feel that. Okay.
I hope most of you are going to be able to come out to the Fountain Lake Farm immediately following my talk, so that you'll be able to really see it and feel it under your souls. And I normally, the talk I'm giving you right now, or at least the slide tray that I brought along, normally takes me a good hour to go through the way I'd like to go through. And I know Ed Schofield and probably Frank Buskey and Grace and some of the others faced the same dilemma. So with that, why don't we just go right to the slides? And Bill, if you would dim the lights, please. Back up one, Maria, please. You had it there for a second. There you go. Curt mentioned the magic of the sand and the influence that it had on particularly Aldo Leopold, and in fact, even in the title of his book that I realized was not chosen by Leopold, but ended up to be a Sand County Almanac. After having lived up here now for a couple of years, I'm equally as fascinated with the magic of the sand, and I'm still discovering some of the secrets that it holds. So we're going to begin the slideshow here, the presentation, with a slide that I think is characteristic of the sand and the value of the sand. We see here a sandhill crane track, and if it wasn't for the sand in this part of the state, no doubt we wouldn't have wild places like crane marshes today. It's simply harder to fill a silo in sand, and because it's poor in terms of its soil nutrition, or poor economically, and as Leopold came to call it, it's poor land but rich country. And he also elaborated that land is someplace where mortgages and corn grows, where rich country is something that, like the sand, is someplace that maybe individual perception and appreciation and a love and sensitivity for wild nature may grow. Okay, with that, we'll go to the title slide. This is what it was supposed to say, George. It's a pioneer homestead that influenced a nation. Okay, when the Muirs came from Milwaukee, they arrived at Milwaukee by steamer from Buffalo, New York, and they came across approximately 100 miles of virgin prairie from Milwaukee to Kingston, Wisconsin. And the virgin Wisconsin landscape looked something like this. Okay. And after a couple of days, a local farmer and land agent by the name of Alexander Gray led Daniel Muir, that was John's father, to this precious place that would become Fountain Lake Farm. Okay. This is the reason that Daniel Muir chose to call the farm Fountain Lake Farm. It's because of the network of bubbling springs or fountains, spring heads, all of which feed the lake that are in the meadow just below the house that I'm fortunate enough to live in now. And this is a shot showing a pair of sandhill cranes down at one of the Muir Springs in the meadow, and that was taken just last year. And this particular pair did launch one chick last year, so it is a suitable nesting habitat for cranes. Okay. This is a sketch that Muir made in the 1860s, and it appeared in the childhood autobiography, The Story of My Boyhood and Youth. And it's simply called Muir's Lake, or Fountain Lake in Perrins, and the Garden Meadow. Muir's Lake was the name that the neighbors gave it, but Fountain Lake was the original name and the one that I feel is historically significant. And he's got here sketched from the roof of the Baroque shanty. He told me where he was when he sketched that scene, so that when my initial research was to discover and document where the Muir farmstead, the original farmstead buildings were, and what the spatial arrangement on the site was of those buildings. So I've spent a lot of time with this sketch. Okay. This beautiful farmstead meadow lying warm in the spring sunshine, nature streaming into me, wooingly teaching her wonderful glowing lessons, every wild lesson a love lesson, not whipped but charmed into me. Oh, that glorious Wisconsin wilderness. This, to me, is an important title slide because in the field of historic preservation, landscape architecture, landscape history, what have you, there is, at least in academia, there's a dichotomy where you either branch off to look at cultural artifacts on the landscape, that is, people-built things, or you favor the natural features of the landscape, those that are put there by nature in their pristine form. I think that not unlike the cup nest of a robin, for instance, in a pioneer lilac in an old homestead, that settlement response, that immigrant response or pioneer response to a setting or to a landscape is no different. And so we as human beings, and as being mammals, another animal, do fit very well into as an ingredient, we'll say, in the landscape. Okay. So that bridges that, I think, quite nicely. Both are gone, passenger pigeons and the Muir building. This appeared in National Geographic. It's kept out in Stockton, California at the University of the Pacific in the Muir Archives. All that is left outside of the, it's not quite true that there's a little more that's remaining of the Baroque shanty. Actually, the sill stones are there. And the accompanying lilacs, there's a beautiful pair of lilacs that's blooming today that used to flank each side of this building. And this was basically a little lean-to or garret-style structure that was built into the hill above the spring, or above that beautiful meadow that we saw. And the first contingent of Muirs that came over here in the spring of 1849, it was an incomplete, it was not the whole family. And they built this in a day or two from rough hewn white and bur oak, and lived in there through that one summer season into the fall. And then finally in November, when the substantial farmhouse was built, they called, as John said, the softer side of the Muir family over from Dunbar, Scotland. And then they came, and by the time that they arrived, the house was ready. Okay, this also becomes very important in trying to document the farmstead there, the physical features or the built features of the farmstead. The top is an original road view. It's a photo that is dated 1863. It shows John Muir sitting here with his sister Sarah Muir, the person that planted the lilacs. This is Sarah's son George. I should say this is her daughter Cecilia. This is son George. And if you look at the bottom here, then that's a sketch again from the story of my boyhood and youth that Muir made while he was still in Wisconsin. That was made in about 1862, the summer of 1862. He came back to Fountain Lake Farm after time at the University in Madison, and this appears in his journal then. It says our first Wisconsin home on the hill near the shanty built in the summer of 1849. I put these on the same slide to show you what a meticulous, as a sketcher, he didn't miss any details. The planting arrangement of the silver maples, the difference in the crown, say, in that oak tree, and the difference in the form in the actual photo. Even the architectural details in terms of the window and door arrangement, the number of panes, the scale, the double chimneys with the lightning rod, and the whole bit. There was an argument going on that when I first started researching this, that how could he have sketched these things back in 1908 at Klamath Lake when he was being followed around by Harriman's secretary, and could sketch it with that kind of recall. But as it turns out, indeed, they were sketched in the 1860s. When I first began my efforts in trying to locate the original buildings, I, of course, went up to the area and would ask old local folks if they could ever heard stories about where the house was or where the barn was or whatever. And I would get an answer something like this: they were over there. And of course, that wasn't good enough. And I started looking at the published references, and I came across this. This is a book that was published in 1973 called The Trail of the Serpent, and its subtitle was The Lore and Legend of the Upper Fox River Valley, co-authored between Bob Gard and Elaine Reitz, who's a local historian from Neshkoro, which is in Marquette County. And as you can see, it was captioned on page 67, John Muir's first Wisconsin home. I had trouble with this from the beginning because it didn't fit the architectural description that Muir gave, for instance, in his autobiography or in other unpublished writings. Okay. So it took me a while to unravel this one. I also, in a book that was published in 1924 by Fred Holmes called Alluring Wisconsin, he also assumed that, and this maybe is where Bob Dart assumed, trusted Fred Holmes' research. But Holmes says, we came upon an old, unpainted, weather-beaten, deserted farmhouse that was fast falling into ruin. Behind it was the glistening lake. Well, after I researched this, and I was fortunate enough to interview a couple of oldsters that have since passed away that grew up here. In fact, Ben Hull, who Bill Edwards at the back of the room knew well, was even the town of Buffalo assessor back in the 20s. Turns out Ben lived in this house for 4 or 5 years shortly after he was married. And without showing him the picture of this house, I had him sketch me a floor plan. And he was 93 when he did this, and it turned out that everything in terms of the window arrangement, where the doors were, where the chimneys were located, so on and so forth, the form of the house, the scale, it turned out to be this house. And he recalls that this house was built by an Irish settler by the name of Hugh McGuinn, and it was located just northeast of a granite marker that now stands in the park. Some of you have probably seen that. It would be very close to County F. I was also told, and this was published in local newspapers, that on a farm that's within eyesight of where I live was a wing that was taken, salvaged from the old Muir house before the Muir house burned to the ground in the first decade of this century. And after, again, on-site research and so on, interviewing people, measuring the wing, it turns out that indeed it is a wing off of a house, but it's off of the Hugh McGuinn house that I just showed you. Okay. So, with no, again, human-built artifacts left to help me along, I started trying to read the landscape itself. And the popular story up here with the local people, passed on from contemporaries of the Muirs and so on, was that there was a house at one time between these old lilacs. And the lilacs, I've documented, it's written that Sarah planted these. They were brought over from Dunbar, Scotland with the first group of Muirs in 1849, the spring of 1849. And Sarah put those on each side of the little shanty that spring. Obviously, if they were going to bring lilacs over and leaving Scotland in February, arriving here in late April, they weren't going to wait and plant them, say, in November when the main house was readied. They set them out immediately on each side of the little shanty. So this is where the Baroque shanty sits. And again, Bill Edwards, who's an emeritus professor of philosophy from Emory back there, caught wind of what I was doing, and it happened that in July of 1942, and I think, correct me, Bill, if I'm wrong, you were fresh out of high school or still a senior or something, but he went out to the Fountain Lake Farm site and took 5 photos. And they turned out to be the only photos really in existence of the site before the little cottage that I live in was built. Now, so here's 1942. These are silver maple trees. And if you go back even farther than this and look at the earliest aerial photos from the 1930s, these silver maple trees really stand out, and of course they're in a line, and their stature in the 30s and the 40s was actually much greater than it is today. They're in the process of dieback now. I'm doing my best to, unlike the Muir Locust, I think I'm doing my best to keep these around. But basically the depression then, or where the farmhouse sat, would be pretty much in the center with these big trees surrounding the depression. Obviously they were planted for shade. Okay. Another one of Bill's photos, both lilacs here. This is where the shanty would have been, and that's where the lane now goes in amongst the maples. Okay. This is a photo that was dated 1920. It's in the iconographic archives at the State Historical Society. It shows a man by the name of David Owens, who is a local farmer. He lives down the road from Fountain Lake Farm, poking around in some depression or another. It wasn't specific as to what depression it was. There's a number of depressions on the site. Turns out that this is not the house depression. It was a smaller shed. Okay. This was also with the same collection at State Historical, and this on the back of it, again, 1920, probably taken by the same photographer that took the previous slide. And it was labeled the doorstep stone to John Muir's home. So kind of make a mental image of the shape of that stone, the topography, this striation here, this indentation, because the next slide is important. Okay, it's a Bill, this is from your collection again. It's not a good picture, but it's a heck of a lot better than nothing. But it shows the depression here. I know my maples now, the John Muir's maples, well enough to recognize that one. And here's this stone again. I believe it's this stone. And the people that built the house on top of this depression recognized the stone as well. And it turns out the stone is still on the site, encased in cement now in my basement somewhere. But anyway, that's what the old, obviously reclaimed, partially reclaimed cellarway depression looked like, and that's very typical for an immigrant cellar situation in the sands. They were strictly nothing like our contemporary full basements. They were just used for vegetable storage, garden stock storage, and so on. And of course, they I think recognized that an airspace below the house was good in terms of preventing rot and so on. Okay. So this little house, this photo was taken in 1948 or 9, but here's one of the lilacs to give you a sense of where we are. Big trees again, taken in wintertime. This little house then was built on the old cellar depression in 1947, and I've interviewed a good number of people that actually worked on digging out the cellar depression and helped build the house that sits on it now. I'm very satisfied with the documentation I was able to come up with. The Park Service was here all week. They just left yesterday, and they also seemed pleased with the findings. Okay. And another shot of that little house that I live in now. This woman now is in her 40s. This is one of the enormous maples there in the front yard that I believe was Muir planted. So when I bought the place in December of 1986, and really came on it by accident, there wasn't a real estate sign by the road or anything. I had been researching this site intimately for 2 years by the time I bought it. And so I had a good working relationship established with the people that owned the site. And I did tell them that if they ever chose to part with it, please let me know before they listed it with a realtor. At that time, I was thinking more in terms of the public good. I was either going to act as a liaison for the Sierra Club or the Nature Conservancy or somebody like that might be interested in purchasing it. And I never thought any more about it, and they assured me they weren't interested in selling. And they came about it by inheritance, and they really never fully appreciated the historical significance of the site. And I received a phone call then in autumn of 1986, and the gentleman asked if I would be interested in buying the property. And I could hardly believe it. And he said, "I don't want to sell it to a nature group." I said, "I'll sell it to you." So I had a house in Madison at the time, and I quickly sold that and closed on this one the day after I closed on the house in Madison. Okay. Today the house looks like this. I should say that photo from before was very flattering. The house had sat vacant for about 30 years, used only by deer hunters for a weekend or so in the fall. And this is what the house, as I said, looks like. The Amish, I hired an Amish carpentry crew, a local Amish crew, and they've done the remodeling on the house to make it much more livable. I suppose it's gentrified or yuppified, but it in no way is supposed to be a replica of the Muir house. However, aesthetically, in terms of how it fits in with the setting, obviously it's natural wood and native stone. It complements the landscape, I think. The choice of the cedar beveled siding, the Muir house would have had pine, but the dimensions of the beveled siding are the same as on the original Muir Fountain Lake farmhouse.
What about the facing of the house there? Is it the same as well? In other words, the directional?
Yeah, it's laid horizontally, you mean, instead of vertically?
No, I mean north-south and west.
It's oriented, of course, identically on the site. In terms of the site orientation, it's identical to the original farmhouse, yes. The Scots, again, like so many ethnic groups, were frugal. They had to be. And if at all possible, when they generally got their 160, they tried to position it facing south. Of course, they realized, just common sense would tell them, that the sun was a real friend in terms of keeping houses that were hard to heat warm. So the Scotch people I've seen in the area, it's very characteristic to see the Scotch building high on a hill with a wide view and always facing south if possible. And This is true of Fountain Lake Farm. It's true of Hickory Hill, the second Muir farm, too. Yeah, both of them. So, in other words, south then would be going through the mums there, so the big trees here in a line are filtering the sunlight into the south. Okay. So what I got there in terms of the beyond just again the human-built things, it was my ambition to restore the landscape finally back to a pre-settlement condition, or the proximate condition that it would have been in when the Muirs arrived. And as Curt said, that was one of the very last things that Aldo Leopold had on his mind, evidently. He did write a letter a week before his death urging Ernie Swift, the old WCD director, to acquire the Fountain Lake property and restore it, and perhaps call it the state's first natural area. And I think that idea pretty much went to the grave with Leopold. And 3 years later, Norman Fassett spearheaded a drive to acquire the Parfrey's Glen site, and that became Wisconsin's first natural area. But anyway, it was in 1960, the previous landowner planted a dog-hair thick pine plantation. It's a red pine plantation. Okay. So the first thing I did was clear cut it, and even with the heavy equipment in there, we saved the shagbark hickories. It's a very characteristic tree of the bur oak and the shagbark hickory as a savanna combination are characteristic of the Fountain Lake Farm. This is a shot of the restoration or the clearing process. I call it the battlefield phase of restoration, where all the stumps now, the trees are cut, the stumps are actually pulled out now. They're sitting on the earth drying, waiting to be pushed into piles and burned. This is what we use to pull the stumps. Unlike John Muir and his brothers and sisters and so on out there grubbing and axing away, this thing is one of 6 commercial stump pullers in the nation. They were developed by Georgia Pacific down south for use in the loblolly pine or the southern yellow pine fields. So that really made short order of the stumpage. This is what it looks like when we started to burn the slash. Okay. And this is where it's pretty well cleared away. The last pile's burning. And clearing red cedars, or the eastern juniper really is what it is. It's not a true cedar. Oftentimes after agriculture moves on, if there's a seed source nearby, red cedar comes in and forms very dense cedar fields that eventually will become glades or forests. And this was the case here, that the last corn was tilled on this site or grown on this site in 1949. So it had about the best part of 40 years to sit, and so these cedars started encroaching. And what we're trying to do is return the landscape back to a pre-settlement grassland, prairie complex, savanna. So they had to go. And also then when I arrived there, there was a wall of vegetation on that slope just below the farmhouse, where the farmhouse stood, that blocked my historic view shed out to the Muir Meadow, to the famous spring meadow, the Muir's sacred garden spot, he called it. Okay. So I clear cut that, and that opened up this view, which is only a partial restoration. That's only not even half restored. But it did at least afford a view similar to what Muir sketched in the autobiography. It also opened up the breezes for circulation. It's amazing the difference it made. Eventually now, through prescribed burning and also selective removal of some of the tamaracks and red osier dogwood that's encroaching, we're going to return that view shed as close to possible as what it was when John Muir was living there. Okay, this is a slide that I like to show to undergraduates that are just coming out of the university in one of the natural sciences or greater ecological fields, disciplines that think they're all set to tackle this whole new art of restoration ecology. But really, our efforts at healing the earth and sort of restoring or correcting our atrocities toward nature is just like this monarch that's just emerged from the chrysalis. And now we're going to rapidly go through some Muir-mentioned landscape components, some flora here. This is the cardinal flower that grows in the meadow. And the prairie chicken, which used to come around the Muir farmhouse, and in the winter when food was low, they would feed the prairie chickens, and prairie chickens were very abundant then. The prairie chicken, for all practical purposes, has been replaced by this bird, which is a Korean or a Chinese bird. It's a pheasant. It's a ring-necked pheasant, and I'm just going to quickly, no, go back, Maria. No, I can't give any lecture that mentions pheasants and prairie chickens without blasting the present day policies that the state has. Right now, the state is, we have a marvelous state-of-the-art facility at Pointe for the propagation of pheasants, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's ecologically insane to be propagating these exotic birds strictly for shooting opportunities when our native gallinaceous or upland grassland birds are going by the boards. Every single one of our native grouse, whether it's the sharp-tail, the prairie chicken, even the ruffed grouse, is being shot out now in local areas, and the bobwhite quail, which isn't a grouse, but it's certainly one of our native grassland birds. All of those birds are on the wane, and yet we still keep pumping millions of dollars, personnel, these facilities that could easily be altered to raise our native birds and replenish those birds. And hunting is not the issue with me right now. I mean, they can go ahead and hunt our native birds. That would be a step in the right direction from hunting these exotic birds that ecologically directly compete with our native birds. So that's something that hopefully before I'm dead is going to be an issue that I'm going to go head to head with them on. Okay. The eastern bluebird, another one of my personal favorites that we have been aggressively trying to restore to the Fountain Lake Farm. We have about 40 bluebird boxes up now that we regularly monitor, and they've been responding very well. This is a slide entitled Cooperation, and this again is just some of the things that Muir was influenced by and exposed to when he was growing up on the farm. The magic of these turtles in Fountain Lake. Foxpups. And frogs. The leopard frog, it was, most of us took swimming lessons from other people. Muir took his swimming lessons from the leopard frogs, and when his father told him that it was time to learn how to swim, he said, go down to the lake and watch the frogs, and you'll become a good swimmer if you study them carefully. So Dan Muir wasn't all bad. He was a Bible-beating Calvinist, there's no question about it. He'd drive his horses, his wife, his daughters, and sons right into the ground. But he did recognize the magic in nature, and there's another time when he explained the beauty of a wood duck to Muir that I don't have time now to quote, but it's... Okay, Muir writes about the lilies and the round-stem bulrush that formed the periphery of the lake. And a crane chick. This is one that, actually this, I'm cheating, I did a project for the International Crane Foundation a couple of years ago. This is from their file, but we do have chicks in the meadow. Prickly pear is a plant that we have already reintroduced. It was extirpated probably back in about the 20s or 30s from the site, and now we have a couple good populations going again. And same with the prairie rose or the wild rose. And we've used children. There's also certainly an educational, inspirational feature to this whole thing, and getting impressionable age children out there collecting prairie seeds, and we've also been doing that. Last year, a little earlier in May, but a little over a year ago, volunteers came out and hand broadcast the tilled area back to prairie. So the seeding is just a year old. So right now it looks pretty much like an old wheat field, but in time it should resemble one of our native prairies. We're also using seed, I should add, from in terms of genetic proximity. We're trying to stay as close to getting seed sources, in other words, as close to the site as possible. So we've been doing a lot of collecting in old cemeteries, along roads, that kind of railroads and so on. And fortunately, there's a prairie nursery within 10 miles or so of the site, so we're also using them. And we did burn, the site's been burned twice since I've been there. This is a burn that took place in late March of 1988. And like I was going to say about the fire, like Curt's Yellowstone lodge poles, the prairie also, or the open grassland, is a fire-dependent community. Okay, now we'll go to the bobwhite quail, one of the birds I mentioned that is not getting enough professional attention at all. There's just simply no good grassroots field data on a lot of our native stuff. But this shows a quail that was singing on the site late last summer as part of the landscape restoration. Of course, also considering the zoological component beyond just the botanical facade. And we did release several coveys of bobwhites on the site, and they're singing this morning, in fact. This just shows me taking one of those coveys in a cage to one of the release sites or the hack sites. Okay. This is, of course, a prairie in its beautiful form. The weeds are gone, but it's basically what we're shooting for is shooting stars. Okay. And this is a savanna community, an oak savanna. The community at the Muir homestead really is an oak hickory savanna. I think that would be ecologically it'd be a more accurate description of it. It's beyond just black oaks and bur oaks and white oaks. But wait a minute. But at any rate, this is someday, again, this is pretty much what that landscape looked like when the Muirs pulled in there on their wagon. And long after we're all gone, hopefully it'll resemble a situation like this. And I want to throw this in. We've been talking a lot about black locust trees today. It's very ironic that Muir received his first lesson, his formal botanical lesson at the university on a black locust, that particular species, because now in the Central Sands, there's no bigger menace than the black locust. And it's a tree that was introduced in the 1930s by the Soil Conservation Service for erosion control. And now, because as Bruce alluded to earlier, it can reproduce every way possible, either by vegetative reproduction through root sprouts or through seed. And it's my nemesis. We're really trying to eradicate black locust now from the site. So it's kind of an interesting turn in that it happens to be one of Muir's favorite trees, I guess. Then also with the prairie restoration, we're putting out some of the old-fashioned garden variety flowers around the house that were there when the Muirs were there, and hollyhock is one of them. And this is a shot of Muir taken in 1863 in Madison. Here's his famous clock desk that's in the lobby of the State Historical Society. That was taken before the State Historical Society encased it in. You got to go back a couple. No. This shot was taken before the State Historical Society encased this clock in a glass or a plastic cube that it's in now, and I think probably, and correct me, Jack, if I'm wrong, it was probably a response to pilferage that was going on. People were taking parts off of this thing to the point where they still today can't get it to run again.
This is pre-1954 rebuilding in the society, and at that point, I think we're on the 4th floor.
Okay.
They made all kinds of new cases in the 50s and put everything in side cases.
Okay. Quite a contraption at any rate. The popular way to describe that is a Rube Goldberg contraption. Okay, this just is an example of some of the other inventions that Muir came up with, more magical contraptions than practical inventions, I think. But this is one of them that's it's copied from the original that's on file in the iconographic collection at State Historical. And I think it depicts, of course, the settlement patterns, early homesteading, basically clearing the forest and savanna and tilling the prairie. But this very well could be the Fountain Lake. It resembles the Fountain Lake house in a general way. And this may be Observatory Hill, which is the high point that's a couple miles to the north and to the east of the farm. And of course, it's some kind of a solar clock, and it looks to me like it's in backwards because it shouldn't be 11, 12, whatever. Okay. And this is a picture of Sylvester Adrian, a local historian and man that used to run a resort on the Fox River and had a special interest in John Muir and local history, particularly the Native American bands. And he's passed on. I didn't get a chance to get to know this man. I missed him by some months. But he really spearheaded the local effort, the grassroots preservation effort, to secure the lands surrounding Fountain Lake in perpetuity, protect them or preserve them in perpetuity. So when I came along a couple of years ago and drafted this proposal to the Park Service to create a National Historic Site out of the boyhood home, it's a very secondary thing compared to what this man spearheaded and really what the county recognized. Had it not been for their efforts in the early 1950s, and the park, of course, was dedicated in 1957. Okay. This is likely what we would have on the shores of Muir's beloved lake. There's absolutely no zoning whatsoever in the Buffalo Township where the farm is. None at all. You can do as you damn please, as long as you can keep up the mortgages and the taxes. And thus, we have this kind of ticky-tacky development along the Fox River. This site is only a mile and a half from where I live. And so it's something that, again, needs a local grassroots effort to, we've got to get some good zoning in this township. The park today is a product of neglect. Marquette County is economically a depressed county. They simply do not have the money or the expertise to oversee the park and really take care of it the way it should be taken care of as a tribute, respectful tribute, hopefully, to a great man like Muir. So you do see this kind of thing where you've got a lot of local vandalism. The area is treated as kind of a local playground.